Jackson Hale didn't move to the edge of the city for calm and quiet, though in a way, that's what he got. His house sat on a hill where an old private road wound like a snake through dense forest. Over the years, he had poured every penny into securing his land and building his own stronghold. High walls, cameras of hidden angles, and motion-activated lights that blinked to life whenever the wildlife wandered too close. For Jackson, the property was his escape and a shield from what he'd never admit, but he didn't need to. Men like him, men with years spent tiptoeing on the line of moral grayness, didn't just disappear. They left things behind, unfinished and messy, and those things had a habit of coming back like vultures. Jackson's money came from the kind of businesses you didn't talk about over dinner. Under-the-table deals, problem-solving, and businesses that thrived in loopholes. He'd made his fortune, lost his conscience, and when it came time to vanish, he took that road out to the outskirts of nowhere and built himself a border no one could cross, or so he thought. The first time Jackson saw the spikes, he didn't believe his eyes. It was close to midnight, and the only sound was the gravel crunching beneath his tires as he rounded the final curve toward home. He almost didn't notice them, thin black strips of metal lying harmlessly across the roadway just before the gates. But a flicker in his headlights betrayed them, the sharp tips glinting like jagged teeth. He slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching to a halt just a foot away. For a moment, he sat there, his hand gripping the steering wheel hard enough to make it creak, staring at the spikes like they were some illusion his tired mind had conjured. But they were very real, crude-looking, industrial-grade tire spikes hammered into the ground with a precision that made his stomach twist. He turned off the engine and stepped out of the car, the heavy night air pressing against his chest. His boots crunched against the gravel as he crouched to inspect the metal. They were secured deep, deliberately placed. Someone had planned this, and worse, someone had been here. Jackson straightened and scanned the trees on either side of the road. Darkness stared back at him, vast and unbroken. His eyes focused on the tree line, searching for movement, but the woods were silent, too silent. His lights illuminated only the edges of the trees, their branches drooping under the weight of the dark. He knew every inch of his property. No one could get this close without setting off the alarms or tripping one of his carefully laid deterrents. Yet here they were, these spikes like some kind of challenge. Jackson Hale didn't take kindly to challenges. It took him an hour to pry the spikes free. He worked silently, sweat dripping on his brow as his tools clanged against metal. When the last piece came loose, he hurled it into the bushes, his breath heavy with frustration. He left the road scarred and uneven, but clear. By the time he closed the gate behind him, locking it with an audible click, he convinced himself that it was nothing, probably a prank, maybe some angry neighbors. He thought the people in the HOA had always been a thorn in his side, complaining about his property being an eyesore or about his refusal to participate in their petty rules. Jackson didn't care. He didn't attend their meetings or answer their letters. He had no HOA contracts or dues to pay. His road was his road, legally purchased along with the land years ago, and no one could tell him what to do with it. But even as he tried to put the incident out of his mind, a small voice nagged him. Someone was testing him. The next morning, Jackson found the envelope tucked into his gate. It was thick paper, cream-colored, with embossed lettering at the top. Homeowners Association. He snorted and tore it open, scanning the page with growing irritation. Unauthorized removal of HOA-installed safety infrastructure. A fine of $11,000 has been issued under Section 17B of Community Compliance Regulations. Repeat offenses may result in legal action. Jackson reread the letter twice. Safety infrastructure? Was this a joke? He crumpled the paper in his fist and tossed it into the truck. He didn't have time for games. By afternoon, the spikes were back. This time, they were driven even deeper, and the heads were painted dark to blend into the gravel. Jackson stood over them, seething. He knew what this was now: control. The HOA had overstepped before, fining him for things that didn't apply to him. Tall grass along the perimeter of his fence, a shed that wasn't matching the aesthetic guidelines, mailboxes painted the wrong shade of beige. He'd ignored every notice, sure they'd get tired of pushing him. But this was different. They were on his road, his property, That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, throwing long shadows across the yard, Jackson sat on his porch and watched the road like a hawk. A cigarette smoldered between his fingers, his mind turning. How had they done it? Who was coming onto his land? Cameras covered his house and the surrounding property, but the road, long and winding as it was, remained a blind spot. Jackson had always figured it was too far out for anyone to bother. He crushed the cigarette against the wooden railing, his jaw tightening. If they wanted a fight, they had picked the wrong man. That night, something felt different. Around 2 a.m., Jackson woke to a sound he couldn't quite place, a dull metallic scrape, faint but distinct. He moved silently, slipping out of bed and grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand. The house was dark, except for the pale glow of the moon filtering through the windows. Outside, the trees swayed, casting jittery shadows against the ground. Jackson crept to the edge of the porch and waited. Then he heard it again, a scrape, followed by a soft clink. His flashlight snapped on, cutting a beam across the road, but there was nothing, just an empty stretch of gravel. Jackson swept the light back and forth, his heart pounding. For the first time in years, a flicker of unease settled in his gut. Someone was out there, just beyond the reach of the light, watching, waiting. He stepped off the porch, gripping the flashlight like a weapon, his breath steady. Whatever this was, it wasn't a prank anymore. And whoever they were about to learn how dangerous it was to provoke a man like Jackson Hale. The next morning, Jackson awoke to the harsh sound of metal scraping against metal. The noise slashed through the quiet dawn like a blade, vibrating in his skull. It was faint, carried by the wind and filtered through his windows, but unmistakable. He shot up from bed, heart pounding, reaching instinctively for the heavy flashlight he now kept beside him. Still groggy, he paused, straining to hear. Silence settled again, heavy and oppressive. But Jackson knew what he heard wasn't just in his head. Someone or something was out there. He didn't bother throwing on a coat, stepping onto the porch in a t-shirt, sweatpants, and boots. The cold morning air bit at his skin, but he ignored it. A thin fog crept along the tree line, twisting like tendrils across the road. It gave everything an eerie, distorted quality. Jackson aimed his flashlight toward the gravel stretch leading to his gate, and there the spikes were back. This time, they were different. Jackson stepped closer, boots crunching against the frost-covered ground, and crouched to get a better look. Unlike before, the spikes were no longer thin black strips tossed randomly across the gravel. These were welded into metal plates, polished to a sinister gleam, their razor-sharp tips pointing upward like the jaws of a trap. They had been drilled and secured into the ground with industrial bolts. Someone had taken their time, working meticulously under cover of night while Jackson slept. His jaw clenched as the realization washed over him. They weren't just provoking him, now this was war. His flashlight swept across the road and landed on a sign planted just beyond the spikes. It hadn't been there yesterday. A professionally made placard, staked into the earth with surgical precision, declared in bold white letters, "Private road. HOA safety installation tampering is a criminal offense." Jackson exhaled sharply, his breath steaming in the cold air. The audacity of it almost made him laugh. HOA safety installation? Who did they think they were fooling? This wasn't a safety measure, this was a land grab. A power play. He could practically hear the smug voice of Ellie Crawford, HOA's president, reading the fine print of some bylaw, as if it justified violating his property. Jackson had seen it all before, petty tyrants using rules as weapons, bending and twisting them to suit their agenda. But HOA had made a grave mistake. They underestimated him. Jackson retrieved a crowbar from his garage and got to work. It wasn't easy. These spikes were anchored deep, bolted down to resist removal. He struggled against the metal, grunting as his muscles strained with each pull. By the time he pried the first plate loose, the sun had risen, and Jackson's breath came in labored bursts. Sweat mixed with the cold air, chilling him to the bone. But he kept going, ripping up plate after plate until the road was once again clear. His palms were raw, his back aching, but a sharp satisfaction settled in his chest as he tossed the last plate into the ditch. Jackson noticed something strange beneath the gravel. where the spikes had been embedded thin wires snaking through the earth, leading toward the tree line. He frowned, brushing away more of the gravel with his fingers. The wires were old, frayed in some spots, but they seemed to disappear into the underbrush, buried just out of view. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to make this happen, and Jackson was starting to wonder just how deep this hole went. That's when the engine noise started. A vehicle was approaching. Jackson turned his head sharply, spotting the familiar shimmer of a black SUV rolling up the road toward his gate. It was HOA again. He knew it without even seeing the tinted windows or Ellie Crawford's smug expression behind the wheel. Sure enough, as the vehicle stopped, Ellie stepped out, dressed as impeccably as always. A crisp beige blazer, a pencil skirt, and that ever-present smile of hers. Too wide to be sincere, too sharp to be comforting. "Good morning, Mr. Hale," Ellie called, her voice syrupy with condescension. Jackson leaned on the crowbar, his chest heaving slightly from exertion. "Ellie," he said flatly. She gestured to the torn-up road and the ditch now littered with metal plates. "It seems you've been busy. Your people put this crap on my road." Jackson's voice was low, simmering with restrained fury. "Without my permission." Ellie sighed, softly shaking her head. "Mr. Hale, as you know, the HOA has a responsibility to ensure the safety of all residents in the area. Several complaints were filed about your road, the speed, the lack of regulation. It was decided that safety measures were necessary to protect the community." "Community?" Jackson barked, a bitter laugh. "What community? This is my land, my road. I've got the deed, Ellie, and you damn well know it." Ellie's smile didn't waver. "With all due respect, Mr. Hale, we've already filed an adjustment to your property boundaries. The HOA has claimed jurisdiction over this road as part of the larger development." Jackson's hands gripped the crowbar tighter. "That's theft. It's regulation," her tone hardened just slightly. "And I'd advise you to tread carefully. Destroying HOA property is a violation that carries significant fines. Removing those spikes could be interpreted as vandalism, or worse, obstruction of safety protocols. Do you really want to escalate this?" Jackson stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Ellie's smile faltered for the briefest second as he loomed over her, the crowbar dangling loosely in his hand. "You tell whoever's behind this that if they come onto my property again, there won't be a next time." Ellie's eyes narrowed, and for a moment all pretense of politeness slipped away, her gaze sharpening like a blade as she measured him carefully. "Mr. Hale," she said softly, almost threateningly, "you really should consider cooperating. It would make things easier." Jackson didn't answer. He simply turned and walked back toward his house, leaving Ellie and her SUV idling by the gate. As he disappeared behind the door, he glanced at the cameras mounted along his porch. The footage was clear, capturing every word, every movement. Inside, Jackson poured himself a cup of black coffee, his hand still trembling slightly with anger. He stared out the window toward the now empty road, Ellie's words echoing in his mind. Cooperating would make things easier. That wasn't a suggestion. That was a threat, and Jackson Hale didn't take kindly to threats. He set the coffee down and reached for his phone. If Ellie thought she could outmaneuver him, she was in for a surprise. Jackson didn't play fair. Not then, not now, and he wasn't about to let anyone take what was his. Jackson spent the rest of the day reinforcing his boundaries. He didn't trust Ellie Crawford, nor did he believe her weak explanations about safety protocols and community concerns. The plates, the spikes, and the wires, they weren't installed to protect anyone. It was an act of deliberate intimidation. The HOA didn't want Jackson to comply. They wanted him to surrender, and that was something he simply wasn't capable of. By mid-afternoon, Jackson had driven the broken remains of the metal plates to the far edge of his property and dumped them into an old ravine. If Ellie or her cronies planned to return for their equipment, they'd need to wade through bramble and mud to get it back. He had made sure the spike traps were gone for good, but his instincts told him this was only the beginning. People like Ellie never backed off after the first push. They doubled down. That suspicion was confirmed at exactly 4 a.m. when Jackson's alarm started screaming. The noise jolted him out of bed, a harsh mechanical wail that echoed through the house. He grabbed his flashlight and shotgun, moving with practiced speed toward the control panel. The motion sensors near the gate were flashing red. Someone was there. Jackson checked the live feed from his cameras and froze. 3 figures in dark clothes stood by the gate. They were working quickly, using tools to bolt something back onto the road. One of them crouched with a cordless drill, sparks flaring as he drove screws into the gravel. Another watched the tree line, head on a swivel, while the third planted a new sign in the dirt. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he zoomed in on the lettering. HOA installation zone, private access restricted. Trespassing will result in legal action. For a moment, Jackson simply stared at the screen, the shotgun heavy in his hands. The audacity of it all. These weren't pranksters or vandals. These were professionals. The way they moved, the way they kept watch, it was clear they'd done this before. Ellie had sent a crew to undo his work, and they were counting on him sleeping through it. Not tonight. Jackson threw on a coat and stepped outside into the freezing dark, the shotgun slung over his shoulder. The forest was silent except for the hum of their drill and the pale moonlight reflecting faintly off the bolts they had already secured into the road. He stayed in the shadows as he approached, moving down the slight incline toward the gate. One of the men turned abruptly as if sensing something and shined a flashlight toward the trees. Jackson froze behind a thick pine, holding his breath until the beam passed over him and moved on. Almost done, the man with the drill muttered, his voice carried in the still air. "Good. I don't want to be here all night," another answered. "She said this guy's a lunatic." Jackson's lip curled, so they were scared of him. Good. He moved closer, silent and steady, until he was just beyond the edge of the clearing. Then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped out of the shadows. "You boys lost." The flashlight whipped toward him, blinding for a split second before one of them shouted, "Who the hell?" "Drop the tools." Jackson's voice was calm, even as he leveled the shotgun across his chest. Not aiming, not yet, but making it clear this was not a negotiation. "You have 10 seconds to pack your toys and get off my property." The man with the flashlight hesitated, glancing toward his partner. "We are with the HOA. I do not care if you are with the FBI." Jackson interrupted. "You are trespassing, now leave." One of them, younger, cockier, stepped forward with his hands raised. "Hey, easy there, buddy. We're just doing our jobs, no need for." Jackson chambered around with a mechanical clack, the sound silencing him mid-sentence. "You are down to 5 seconds." The men looked at each other, realizing he was not bluffing. The one with the drill dropped it, the tool clattering against the gravel. All right, he said, backing away. "We are going." "Take the sign with you," Jackson added, "and tell Ellie Crawford that if she sends anyone else onto my land, they will not walk out so easy next time." They scrambled to gather their tools, ripping the freshly planted sign from the dirt. Jackson watched as they piled into a black truck parked just outside the gate and sped off, tires kicking up gravel. The rumble of the engine faded into the distance, leaving Jackson alone in the cold. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. His road was scarred again, littered with half-secured bolts and tools left behind in their hurry to escape. It was a mess, but it was his mess, and for now it was clear. Jackson turned back toward the house, knowing this was not over. Ellie would not take this loss lying down. If anything, it would embolden her. People like Ellie did not know when to stop, and that is what made them dangerous. Sure enough, the next morning, Jackson found a legal notice taped to his gate. It was thick, printed on the same fancy stationery as before, and reeked of petty authority. Notice of violation. It began and went on to accuse Jackson of obstructing HOA operations, interfering with safety infrastructure, and threatening association contractors. Fines were listed, absurd sums that totaled nearly $10,000. At the bottom, in perfect cursive, Ellie Crawford's signature smirked up at him like a challenge. Jackson crumpled the letter and tossed it aside. Fines meant nothing to him. They could not touch his land with money alone, and he knew Ellie did not have the legal right to install those spikes in the first place. But it was not about the fines, it was not even about the spikes. It was about control, about testing him, pushing him until he either submitted or lashed out. And Jackson had no intention of giving her the satisfaction of either. That night, Jackson sat on his porch with a bottle of whiskey and watched the road. The forest was quiet, the moon casting long shadows across the clearing. His shotgun rested against the wall beside him, loaded and ready. Ellie thought she could outsmart him, thought she could intimidate him with her petty rules and her hired thugs. But she had made a critical mistake. She had come onto his land and declared war without knowing what kind of man she was up against. Jackson Hale was not afraid of people like Ellie Crawford. He had dealt with worse in his lifetime. Sharks in expensive suits, grifters who smiled as they gutted you for everything you were worth. Compared to them, Ellie was just another pretender with a clipboard and a superiority complex. But there was something more to this. The wires, the tools, the way her men had worked in practice silence, it felt orchestrated, calculated. This was not just about HOA authority. Something else was in play here. As he sat there, staring at the darkened road, Jackson made himself a promise. If Ellie wanted a fight, he would give her one. But he would not just fight back, he would dismantle her operation completely. Whatever game she was playing, whatever influence she thought she had, Jackson Hale was going to take it all away from her, piece by piece, and then he would make her regret ever stepping onto his land. Jackson knew the men would return, but what unsettled him most was how quickly they worked like clockwork. Ellie Crawford had connections, that much was certain, but her precision, the calculated movements of her hired hands, was the mark of something bigger. These were not just overly ambitious HOA enforcers slapping fines on residents for unapproved fences or improper landscaping. This was systematic. He spent the next day combing through his property, determined to uncover whatever Ellie thought she controlled. His boots sank into the frost-covered earth as he followed the same thin wires he had discovered beneath the gravel where the spikes had been installed. With a small spade in hand, he dug carefully, unraveling the line like a spider's web. After 20 minutes, the wires led him to something that made his blood run cold. A small metallic device, partially buried in a shallow trench beneath the foliage. It was no bigger than a shoebox, dark gray, with the faint hum of active electronics. The logo stamped on the surface was one he had not seen in years. CCI Technologies. Jackson muttered under his breath. CCI was not just any tech supplier. Years ago, back when Jackson still ran with less than reputable crowds, they had been at the center of a massive corporate surveillance scandal, installing safety equipment in private areas that doubled as monitoring systems. Their reach was vast, their pockets deep enough to silence lawsuits before they ever made it to trial. Jackson had a sinking feeling that the wires and the devices were not just about installing spikes to slow traffic. This was surveillance. He carried the device back to his garage, slamming it onto the workbench under the flickering overhead light. There was no obvious way to open it, no screws, no access panels. Whoever built it ensured it was not something that could be dismantled with a simple screwdriver. He turned it over, inspecting every inch, and that was when he noticed the faint blinking light beneath the casing, a red LED pulsing like a heartbeat. Jackson frowned. A GPS tracker. They had been watching him. He exhaled slowly. So this was how deep it went. HOA was just a front. CCI was pulling the strings, and now Jackson had the proof. If Ellie thought she could push him into compliance, she had another thing coming. He wanted to see how they liked being watched. Jackson retrieved a pair of wire cutters and a roll of industrial tape, rigging the device just enough to keep it transmitting. Then he took his truck, drove 10 miles into town, and stopped beneath an overpass. There, he tucked the device beneath the axle of a rusted-out van that had not moved in years, its tires sunken, its windows caked with grime. If Ellie's people wanted to follow his movements, they would get a hell of a surprise trying to track him through abandoned lots and empty streets. That night, Jackson sat on his porch with a thermos of coffee, eyes fixed on the road. His cameras were running, motion sensors armed. If Ellie sent her men again, he would be ready. But by midnight, the forest remained silent, the road untouched. No SUVs rolled up to his gate. No sparks from drills lit the darkness. It was almost disappointing. Jackson had been spoiling for a fight. The next morning, a letter arrived. It was not taped to the gate this time. The envelope sat neatly in his mailbox, hand-delivered by someone who had been bold enough to step onto his property unnoticed. The paper inside was heavier than usual, embossed with gold HOA lettering. Jackson skimmed the contents, his jaw tightening with every line. Notice of legal action. By failure to comply with HOA safety standards and regulations, and by engaging in destruction of community property, the association has filed an emergency injunction for restricted access to your property under Section 18C of Regional Development Law. Further failure to comply will result in foreclosure proceedings. Jackson's hands crumpled the letter before he could stop himself. Foreclosure on his property. The audacity of it stunned him, even knowing how far Ellie was willing to go. But this was not just Ellie anymore. The involvement of CCI Technologies confirmed what Jackson had suspected. This was bigger than HOA politics. Someone wanted his land. He needed leverage. Jackson did not waste time. He loaded up his truck with equipment, bolt cutters, floodlights, even an old hunting rifle he had not touched in years, and headed back to the tree line where the device had been buried. If CCI had been careless enough to leave one wire exposed, there had to be more. Sure enough, an hour of digging revealed a network of cables stretching deeper into his property, leading farther up the ridge. When Jackson finally reached the end of the line, his breath caught. Tucked into a clearing, hidden from view, surrounded by trees on all sides, sat a small steel utility shed. Its exterior was painted dark to blend with the forest, a thick padlock securing the double doors. No markings gave away its purpose. Jackson crouched low, inspecting the ground around the shed. Fresh tire tracks. Someone had been here recently. Whatever was inside the shed was not meant to be found. He stood, rolling his shoulders and gripping the bolt cutters. Let's see what is so damn important. The padlock snapped with a metallic crack, and Jackson pushed the doors open. The interior was sparse, lit only by the pale glow of a single monitor mounted on a metal desk. It displayed a map, his property, his road, and several marked areas highlighted in red. Cameras, microphones. The entire ridge had been wired for surveillance, and judging by the timestamps on the feed, they were still live. Jackson's pulse hammered as he leaned closer, scanning the data on the screen. Ellie had not just been watching him. They had been mapping his movements, cataloging every corner of his property. And then he saw something that made his blood freeze. A blinking red near the edge of his house. Someone was there, right now. Jackson bolted back to his truck, adrenaline surging through him as he sped down the ridge, tires skidding across the gravel. When his house came into view, he saw the flash of movement near the garage. A figure dressed in black, disappearing around the corner. Jackson slammed on the brakes, jumped out, and raised the rifle. Get the hell off my property. The figure didn't stop. Jackson fired a warning shot into the ground, the sharp crack of the rifle echoing through the trees. This time, the figure froze. Slowly, they turned, raising their hands in surrender. Jackson advanced cautiously, keeping the rifle trained on them as the floodlights kicked on, illuminating the intruder's face. It wasn't one of Ellie's goons. It was a young woman, no older than 30, with dark hair pulled back into a braid. She wore black cargo pants and a tactical jacket, but there was no malice in her expression, only exhaustion. "Don't shoot," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not here to hurt you." "Then why the hell are you sneaking around my house?" Jackson growled. The woman lowered her hands slightly. "Because you're in danger, Mr. Hale. They're not going to stop until they take everything you have. And if you don't listen to me, you're going to lose this fight." Jackson stared at her, the rifle still raised, every instinct telling him not to trust her. But something in her tone, the quiet urgency, the hint of fear she tried to hide, gave him pause. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. She hesitated, then said, "My name's Kara. I used to work for CCI. I know what they're doing, and I know how to stop it." For the first time in weeks, Jackson felt his certainty waver. He didn't trust her, but he couldn't ignore the weight of her words. If she was telling the truth, then this wasn't just about HOA power or petty fines. It was something far worse, and it was coming for him. Jackson didn't lower the rifle. The woman, Kara, if that was even her real name, held her ground, hands still raised in what felt like a rehearsed show of compliance. She was calm. Too calm for someone staring down the barrel of a loaded gun, and that fact nagged at him. The floodlights cast stark shadows across her face, highlighting sharp cheekbones and dark eyes that betrayed no fear. She was either brave, reckless, or exactly the kind of trouble he didn't need. "You've got 30 seconds to explain what the hell you're doing here," Jackson said, his voice low and flat. "Then I'm calling the sheriff." "If the sheriff is going to help you, they'd have done it by now," Kara replied. "You've noticed, haven't you? How they don't show up when HOA calls, but they're here the second you push back. Someone's bought them, Mr. Hale, and it's not Ellie Crawford. CCI is pulling the strings." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about CCI?" "I worked for them for 3 years," Kara said quickly, seizing on his hesitation. "They're not just a tech company. They specialize in surveillance, acquisition, and control. They partner with homeowner associations to upgrade neighborhoods, but the upgrades are a smokescreen. They use HOA bylaws to get what they really want: land, leverage, compliance. Your property isn't just valuable because of its size," she continued. "They think there is an underground water source here, a natural aquifer. Fresh water is a gold mine in today's market. If they control access to it, they control everything around it. Ellie Crawford's HOA is just a tool. They feed her promises of profit and development, and she does their dirty work. Fines, foreclosure threats, forced compliance. It is a playbook I have seen before." Jackson ran a hand over his jaw, the pieces clicking together in his mind like tumblers in a lock. He thought of the buried cables, the shed in the woods, the precise placement of the spikes. This wasn't some arbitrary flex of power. CCI had been working toward this for months, maybe longer, and Ellie, smug and self-satisfied, probably thought she was in charge when she was little more than a pawn herself. "How do you know all this?" Jackson asked. Kara hesitated, then said, "I quit when I realized what they were doing, but not before I took files. Maps, contracts, names of their clients. I knew I couldn't stop them alone, but someone like you're exactly the kind of problem they don't know how to handle." Jackson almost laughed at that. "You got a hell of a lot of faith in someone you just met." "Not faith," she said, meeting his eyes, desperation. Before he could respond, one of the monitors flickered, drawing his attention. The camera feed for the western perimeter had gone black. Jackson leaned forward, his pulse quickening. "Damn it. What is it?" Kara asked sharply. "Someone's here." Jackson grabbed the rifle, flicking off the safety as he stalked toward the back door. Kara followed close behind, a tense shadow at his heels. Outside, the night was unnervingly quiet. The forest pressed in like a wall of darkness, and the air smelled faintly of smoke. Jackson's flashlight cut a narrow beam through the trees as he moved toward the broken camera. When he reached it, the housing was smashed, wires dangling like severed veins. Jackson crouched to inspect the damage, and that was when he noticed the footprints, heavy, deliberate tracks leading deeper into the woods. "They're watching us," Kara whispered. Jackson rose, scanning the darkness with narrowed eyes. "Let them watch. They're not ready for what happens next." But the next move wasn't his. It was theirs. When they returned to the house, Jackson saw it immediately. The front door had been forced open. A cold dread settled in his chest. He stepped inside, rifle raised, and swept the room. Papers were scattered across the floor. Cabinet doors hung open. His tools, his files, his life had been rifled through like trash. Kara picked up one of the envelopes from the floor and held it up to the light. They were looking for something. Jackson didn't respond. His gaze fell on the table near the window, where a burning matchbook smoldered against a stack of his records. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stamping it out before the fire could spread. The matchbook was from a bar in town. Jackson turned it over in his fingers, the name printed in bold letters across the back. The Rusted Stag. He had been there once or twice, long enough to know it was the kind of place where people talked too much after a few drinks. He glanced at Kara, who was already watching him with expectation. This was a lead, and they both knew it. Someone had been inside his house, searching through his things, and they had left this behind. Whether it was intentional or not, Jackson intended to find out. He grabbed his jacket, checked his rifle, and nodded toward the door. "We are going for a drive." The town was quiet when they arrived, the streets mostly empty except for a few parked cars outside the bar. The neon sign flickered overhead, buzzing faintly in the night air. Jackson pulled into a spot near the entrance and cut the engine, his gaze sweeping over the vehicles lined up along the curb. No black SUVs. No tinted windows. Just old trucks and sedans that had seen better days. Good. They stepped inside, the warm scent of whiskey and cigarette smoke wrapping around them instantly. A few heads turned in their direction, mostly regulars sizing up newcomers, but no one paid them much attention. Jackson scanned the room, his eyes landing on the bartender, an older man with gray hair and a sharp gaze. He had been working here for years, long enough to know everyone who walked through those doors. Jackson approached the bar, setting the matchbook down on the counter. "Recognize this." The bartender glanced at it, then at Jackson. "Maybe. Depends on why you are asking. Someone left it at my place last night. I want to know who." The bartender exhaled slowly, wiping a glass with deliberate care. "A lot of people come through here. A lot of matchbooks get passed around. You will have to be more specific." Jackson reached into his jacket, pulling out a $100 bill, folding it neatly between his fingers before setting it beside the matchbook. "How about now?" The bartender's gaze flicked down, then back up. He sighed, leaning in slightly. "Guy came in 2 nights ago. Didn't belong here. Suit, expensive watch, the kind of man who does not drink whiskey out of plastic cups. He asked a lot of questions about a man who lived out past the ridge." He tapped the matchbook. "Left that when he paid." Jackson felt a slow burn rise in his chest. Someone had been watching him longer than he realized. Did he say anything else? The bartender hesitated. Just that his employer was interested in acquiring local property. Said the man he was looking for was about to have a problem he couldn't handle. Jackson clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists. If that was supposed to be a warning, they had underestimated him. He did not scare easily, and he never backed down from a fight. Kara shifted beside him, her expression unreadable. Jackson could tell she was processing the bartender's words, turning them over in her mind the same way he was. Whoever this man was, he had been looking for Jackson before things escalated. This was not just about HOA pressure or petty fines. Someone with real power had taken interest in his land, and that meant things were about to get worse. Jackson turned back to the bartender, his voice low. "Did he leave a name?" The bartender shook his head. "No name, just a matchbook and a bad attitude. Drank 1 whiskey, barely touched it, then left. Drove off in a car too nice for this town." That narrowed it down. Jackson knew the type. Corporate men with polished shoes and empty threats. If they had sent someone like that ahead of time, then CCI had been setting this up long before Ellie Crawford ever tried to find him. Jackson grabbed the matchbook, pocketing it as he turned to leave. "Come on," he said to Kara. They stepped outside, the cool night air washing over them as they walked to the truck. Jackson was quiet for a long moment before finally speaking. "You trust that bartender?" Kara leaned against the door, arms crossed. "I trust that he knows when to keep his mouth shut." Jackson exhaled, staring out at the empty street. They were running out of time. CCI was making their move, and he needed to be ready. If they were willing to break into his home, plant surveillance, and send lawyers after him, then what came next would not be another fine. It would be something permanent. Kara watched him carefully. "You have a plan?" Jackson nodded. "Yeah, but first, I need to know how deep this goes." Kara hesitated before speaking again. "There's someone I used to work with at CCI, a security consultant. If they're involved in this, he might know." Jackson glanced at her. "You trust him?" "Not even a little, but he likes money, and he owes me a favor." Jackson considered that for a moment, then nodded. "All right, we find him. If this guy knows anything, we use it." Kara nodded once, then pulled out her phone, typing something quickly before tucking it back into her pocket. Jackson started the truck, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. He didn't like relying on other people, but this was bigger than just him now. They needed answers, and they needed them fast. As they pulled onto the road, Jackson caught movement in the side mirror. A car parked in the shadows down the street, headlights off, engine barely audible. His gut told him it wasn't a coincidence. He took a slow breath, adjusting the mirror to get a better look. Dark windows, no plates. Someone was watching them. He tapped the dashboard, getting Kara's attention. "We got company." Her eyes flicked to the mirror, her jaw tightening. Think they will follow? Jackson smirked, shifting gears. Let's find out. He hit the gas, the truck surging forward as the car behind them hesitated for a second before pulling out onto the road. The chase was on. Jackson's grip tightened on the steering wheel as he pushed the truck faster, the headlights of the trailing car bouncing in the rearview mirror. Whoever was following them wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. The dark sedan kept pace, creeping closer as they sped toward the outskirts of town. Kara reached for the glove compartment, pulling out a loaded handgun, checking the magazine before setting it in her lap. Jackson didn't comment. He had expected as much. They had been waiting for this moment, and now that it had arrived, he wasn't about to waste it. He took a sharp left, cutting down a side road leading toward the forested ridge. The sedan hesitated for a moment before following, its tires screeching against the pavement. That slight delay told Jackson one important thing. They weren't locals. They didn't know these roads the way he did. Good. He pressed the gas harder, the truck jolting as they hit a rough patch of gravel. Kara braced herself against the dashboard. What's the plan? Jackson's eyes remained on the road. Lose them first. Then we find out who they are. The trees thickened as they climbed higher into the hills, the road narrowing into a winding path barely wide enough for two vehicles. Jackson took another sharp turn, feeling the tires slip slightly before gripping again. Behind them, the sedan struggled to keep up, its headlights swinging wildly as the driver tried to match Jackson's movements. They weren't just following, they were trying to push him. Jackson spotted the upcoming curve, a sharp bend with a sudden drop-off on the other side. He knew the road well. The other driver didn't. He waited until the last possible second before cutting the wheel hard, drifting the truck around the bend with practiced precision. The sedan wasn't as lucky. The moment it hit the curve, the driver overcorrected, the rear tires losing traction. Jackson watched in the mirror as the car skidded sideways, the momentum carrying it straight toward the embankment. The sedan slammed into the dirt, kicking up a cloud of dust and gravel before coming to a stop at an awkward angle. Jackson didn't slow down. Not yet. He needed distance. They barreled forward for another half-mile before he finally eased off the gas. Kara exhaled, glancing back. Think they're done? Jackson wasn't sure. He had seen enough bad situations to know that nothing was over until the bodies were counted. He pulled the truck onto a hidden trail, cutting the headlights and letting the engine idle as they watched the road behind them. The dust settled, the night falling silent once more. After a few tense moments, Jackson finally spoke. If they survive that, they'll be coming. We need to be ready. Kara nodded, her fingers still wrapped around the gun. Then let's make sure we are. Jackson drove the truck deeper into the trees, finding a place to hide. The road twisted into narrow trails, barely visible between thick brush and towering pines. He knew these paths well, had spent years mapping them out, ensuring he always had an escape route if he ever needed one. Tonight, that preparation was paying off. He pulled the truck off the main trail, rolling to a stop behind a dense wall of undergrowth. The engine hummed quietly before he cut the ignition, plunging them into silence. Kara shifted in her seat, her gaze flicking between the trees, listening for any sign of pursuit. Jackson stayed still, letting the quiet settle. The night had a way of carrying sound out here, and if anyone was following them, he wanted to hear them first. Minutes passed. The wind rustled the branches overhead. A faint owl call echoed in the distance, but nothing else. Finally, Kara exhaled. Think they'll keep looking. Jackson considered it. Maybe, but that wreck back there will slow them down. If they're smart, they'll retreat, regroup. If they're desperate, they'll push forward. Kara nodded, her fingers tapping lightly against the dashboard. Desperate people make mistakes. Jackson smirked. That's what I'm counting on. He opened the door carefully, stepping out into the cool night air. The scent of pine and damp earth filled his lungs as he moved toward the back of the truck, lowering the tailgate. He pulled out a heavy-duty flashlight, clicking it on and scanning the ground. No fresh tracks beyond their own. They were alone, at least for now. Kara joined him, rubbing her arms against the chill. We need to figure out who they are before they come back. Jackson nodded, already thinking ahead. We need leverage. He motioned for her to follow as he moved toward a clearing, keeping his steps light against the uneven ground. If CCI was involved, if they were sending people after him, then that meant they had something to lose. And Jackson intended to find out exactly what that was. Kara walked beside him, scanning the tree line. You think they're watching us right now? Jackson's jaw tightened. Probably. They always are. That's how these kinds of people work. They push, they watch, they wait for you to break. He turned to face her. But I don't break. Kara studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. Because neither do I. They moved through the trees, following a small, rocky path leading toward the northern ridge. Jackson had a hunch, and if he was right, there was something waiting for them at the top, something worth finding. If they wanted to fight him, they had picked the wrong man. The ridge overlooked the valley, giving a clear view of the land below. Jackson stood at the edge, his sharp gaze sweeping across the dense tree line, following the distant outline of the town. The lights flickered faintly in the darkness, a reminder of the world he had left behind. He wasn't a man who trusted easily, and right now, trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. Kara stepped beside him, her breath steady despite the climb. You see anything? Jackson didn't answer immediately, his focus locked on a single point near the highway. A vehicle, headlights dimmed, idled near the roadside as if waiting. He exhaled slowly. Yeah, we're not alone. Kara followed his gaze, eyes narrowing. How long do you think they've been sitting there? Long enough. Jackson turned away from the ridge, his mind already piecing together the next steps. He needed answers, not just about CCI, but about their real objective. The land, the surveillance, the control pressure they had been applying, it was all leading to something. And Jackson wasn't the type to wait for trouble to knock twice. We head down, he said. There's something they don't want us to see, and I intend to find out what it is. Kara nodded without hesitation, falling in step beside him as they descended from the ridge. The path was narrow, winding between jagged rocks and uneven terrain. Jackson moved carefully, his boots silent against the damp soil. He had spent years memorizing every inch of his property, but something about this night felt different. The silence was heavier, the air thick with something unspoken. At the base of the ridge, the ground leveled into a wide clearing. Jackson's gut tightened as they stepped forward. The trees had been disturbed. Branches snapped, footprints pressed deep into the mud. Someone had been here recently, and they hadn't tried to hide it. Kara crouched near the tracks, running her fingers lightly across the dirt. More than one person, she murmured. Heavy boots, moving fast. Jackson's gaze lifted, following the trail of footprints leading toward the tree line. They weren't just passing through. They were searching for something. He tightened his grip on the rifle slung over his shoulder. We keep moving. They followed the path cautiously, the forest closing in around them. Every shadow felt stretched, every sound amplified in the quiet. Jackson wasn't afraid of the dark, but he respected it. Darkness was where things hid, and right now, something was hiding from them. As they moved deeper, the faint glow of artificial light flickered through the branches. Jackson stopped short, holding up a hand. Ahead of them, partially hidden behind the trees, a small structure stood. Metal walls, a reinforced door, no windows. It looked new. Too new. Kara's voice was barely a whisper. That wasn't here before. Jackson's expression hardened. No, it wasn't. Jackson moved first, approaching the structure with careful steps. The metal exterior was smooth, unmarked, almost sterile in its design. This wasn't some abandoned shed or makeshift storage unit. It had been built with intent, placed here for a reason. Kara followed closely, her hand hovering near the pistol strapped to her side. She wasn't nervous, but Jackson could tell she was ready. That was good. He needed someone ready. He reached the door and ran his fingers along the reinforced seams. Locked. No handle, no keypad. Just a steel barrier meant to keep people out. Or maybe keep something in. Jackson stepped back, scanning the perimeter. If CCI had put this here, they had done it fast. There were no signs of wear, no weathering from the elements. This was recent. A week, maybe less. Kara knelt beside the door, pressing her ear to the metal. No sound. That doesn't mean it's empty, Jackson muttered. She nodded, standing again. So how do we get inside? Jackson exhaled, rolling his shoulders. He could blow the door open, but that would be messy, loud, and he wasn't sure how much time they had before whoever built this place came back. We need a key, or we need someone who can open it for us. Kara smirked slightly. Lucky for you, I know just the guy. Jackson arched an eyebrow. Convenient. Kara shrugged. I told you, I used to work for them. I know how they operate. If they lock something this tight, there's a reason. And I bet my old contact knows exactly what it is. Jackson didn't like relying on outsiders, but right now, he didn't have a better option. If there was something inside this structure that could explain why CCI wanted his land, he needed to see it. Let's go find your guy, he said. Kara pulled out her phone, typing quickly before pocketing it again. He's in town. If we leave now, we can get to him before CCI knows we're coming. Jackson turned back toward the truck, his mind already calculating the risks. This was dangerous. They were poking at something bigger than either of them, and the deeper they went, the fewer ways out he could see. But he wasn't stopping. Not now. They drove in silence, the weight of what they had found settling between them. Jackson kept an eye on the rearview mirror, expecting another tale, another interruption. But the roads remained empty, the town coming into view without resistance. That made him uneasy. It meant CCI wasn't chasing them. It meant they were waiting. The bar Kara led him to was small, tucked away near the outskirts of town. It wasn't the kind of place Jackson would have chosen to do business, but it served its purpose. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, the dim lights casting everything in a hazy glow. Kara scanned the room, then nodded toward a booth in the corner. There he is. Jackson followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. Let's get some answers. The man sitting in the booth barely looked up as they approached. He was older than Jackson expected, late 50s, maybe early 60s, with deep lines etched into his face. His clothes were worn but clean, and his posture was relaxed, too relaxed for someone who had spent years working in security. Kara slid into the seat across from him, motioning for Jackson to follow. Jackson didn't sit. He stood near the edge of the table, his presence looming over the conversation. The man exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the rim of his glass. Been a long time, Kara. She nodded. Not long enough. Jackson didn't have time for pleasantries. He leaned forward slightly. We need access to a locked facility. Metal structure, no windows, reinforced entry. The man smirked. Sounds like CCI. What's inside? That's what we want to know, Kara said. And you're going to help us get inside. The man chuckled, shaking his head. You don't ask for small favors, do you? Jackson's patience was thinning. We are not asking. The older man studied him carefully, then exhaled. You got lucky finding me before they did. Jackson's eyes narrowed. Why is that? Because whatever's inside that building, CCI is willing to kill for it. The table fell silent. Jackson processed the words, the weight of them settling over him. This wasn't just about his land anymore. This was something far worse. The man leaned forward, lowering his voice. If you are serious about this, you better be ready for what's coming. Jackson met his gaze, unwavering. I've been ready my whole life. Being a judge, I never expected to find my Mercedes disappeared from my own driveway, or discover our HOA president was running a criminal operation selling residents' cars through her brother-in-law's dubious dealership. What happened when this power-hungry HOA president realized she just clashed with the wrong homeowner? Welcome to my channel. Please subscribe if you want more Karen and HOA incidents that I pulled into my neighborhood after a long 2-day judicial conference. Looking forward to sleeping in my own room. The sunset cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of Oakwood Estates, where every blade of grass had to meet Margaret Winter's strict HOA regulations. As I turned onto my street, something felt strange. My driveway was empty. My silver Mercedes, a car I'd saved 5 years to buy, was vanished. My hands shook as I parked my rental car and rushed to my front entrance that a bright orange notice caught my eye, taped crookedly across my door handle. The paper was signed with a flourishing signature I'd seen plastered across 2 mini violation warnings. Margaret E. Winters, HOA President. The notice claimed my car violated some new rule about commercial vehicles because of my courthouse parking authorization sticker. I checked the date. The notice was from just 2 days earlier. Mrs. Chin from next door hurried over in her gardening clothes, worry written across her features. She explained how she'd watched helplessly as a tow truck came at 3 o'clock in the morning. When she tried to stop them, showing photos of how the car had been legally parked in my driveway for years, Margaret had threatened her with fines for obstructing HOA business that I walked around my empty driveway, my mind spinning. The spot where my Mercedes usually sat showed no signs of fluid leaks or any other issues. My phone buzzed with a text from Ted Rodriguez across the street. Check your security cameras. You need to see what really happened. That as I unlocked my door, I noticed Margaret watching from her second-floor window, binoculars in position. She'd been appointed HOA president just 3 months ago after our beloved former president, Mr. Johnson, mysteriously stepped down. Since then, she'd turned our peaceful community into her personal territory, measuring grass with rulers and issuing fines for everything from unapproved bird feeder heights to excessive walking on sidewalks. Inside, I found 5 more violation notices shoved under my door, each for increasingly bizarre offenses. Unauthorized professional vehicle storage was cited multiple times, along with displaying government credentials without HOA authorization. The final notice mentioned something about immediate removal rights, a clause I'd never seen in our HOA bylaws during my 15 years residing here. My security system chimed as I pulled up the footage from 2 nights earlier. What I saw made my blood run cold. Margaret wasn't just supervising the tow. She was directing it with almost gleeful excitement, pointing and gesturing like a conductor leading an orchestra of disaster. But it was what happened next that really caught my focus. That a sleek black BMW pulled up, and a man in an expensive suit got out to talk with Margaret. Even with the night vision camera, I could see the family similarity. This had to be her brother-in-law, the used car dealer from across town. They were pointing at my car, laughing, and what I read on their lips made my stomach churn. As a judge, I'd seen my share of scams and frauds in the courtroom. But this felt different. This was personal. What they didn't know was that I'd just been appointed to oversee civil property cases in our region. And as I sat there in my empty house, staring at the spot where my Mercedes should have been, I realized this was bigger than just a missing vehicle. The question was, how deep did this corruption really spread? My hands were shaking as I rewound the security footage from my driveway camera. The timestamp read 3:17 a.m. when a tow truck crept up my street with its lights off. But what made my blood run cold was seeing Margaret Winters in her designer pajamas and pearls directing the driver with enthusiastic hand gestures like she was conducting an orchestra. She even took selfies next to my car as it was being hooked up. I was still staring at my screen when my doorbell rang. It was Ted Rodriguez from across the street, looking nervous and clutching his phone. "Judge Anderson, you need to see this," he whispered, glancing over his shoulder. He pulled up a video he'd taken at the community pool yesterday. There was Margaret holding court with her usual group of yes men, her voice loud and proud. "These people think they can park whatever they want in their driveways. While I'm cleaning up this neighborhood one eyesore at a time." The video got worse. Margaret went on to brag about how she'd already removed cars from the Singh family's driveway because their grocery delivery van lowered property values, and from old Mrs. Chin's house because her grandson's car looked too cheap for our standards. She even waved a stack of what looked like tow company receipts, saying she was making the neighborhood great again, one tow at a time. Ted leaned in closer. "There's more. I've been watching her for weeks. She only targets certain people, mostly newcomers, minorities, or anyone who's questioned her at HOA meetings. But here's the really crazy part." He pulled up another video showing Margaret meeting with a man in an expensive suit behind the clubhouse. They were looking at photos of cars on her phone, and the man was nodding and writing checks. Just then my work phone buzzed. It was the courthouse confirming my new appointment as the supervising judge for civil property cases in our district. The irony would have been funny if I wasn't so angry. I'd spent 15 years building a reputation for being fair and level-headed on the bench, but watching Margaret literally steal from our neighbors made my judicial calm waver. "Ted," I said, "we need to know where these cars are going. Can you help me?" He smiled and pulled out a small notebook. "Already on a judge. I'm not just a concerned neighbor. I'm an investigative reporter for the Daily Tribune. I've been gathering evidence about HOA fraud across the county." Margaret's just the tip of the iceberg. As we talked, another neighbor hurried over. Sarah Chun, Mrs. Chin's granddaughter, was in tears, Judge Anderson. They just took Grandma's car, too. She needs it for her dialysis appointments. I watched Margaret through my window strutting down the sidewalk in her designer heels, clipboard in hand, hunting for her next target. What she didn't know was that her perfect little power trip was about to crash into a wall of justice. I picked up my phone to call the courthouse, but then I noticed something odd in the security footage that made me pause. Behind Margaret in the tow truck, there was another car, one I recognized from the courthouse parking lot. The pieces were starting to fit together, but I needed proof. I turned to Ted. How would you like an exclusive story about corruption that goes way beyond our little neighborhood? My hands trembled as I opened the email from the county clerk's office. The auction record showed my Mercedes, worth over $50,000, had been sold for just $12,000 to Winters Premium Auto, a dealership I'd never heard of. My legal training kicked in as I started digging through public records. The dealership's owner was none other than Margaret's brother-in-law, James Winters. I called the courthouse archive department where my old friend Susan worked. She gasped when I told her about my car. Judge Anderson, you're the fourth person this week asking about HOA vehicle auctions in your neighborhood. She sent over records showing a disturbing pattern. 6 other cars had been sold the same way in just 2 months. The victims weren't random. Mrs. Chun, an 80-year-old widow, lost her late husband's vintage Corvette. The Garcia family had their work van taken while they were visiting sick relatives. Dr. Patel's Tesla disappeared during his hospital night shift. Each car was sold for a fraction of its value, all to Winters Premium Auto. I spread the documents across my dining room table when my doorbell rang. It was Mrs. Chun, clutching a stack of papers and fighting back tears. I was too scared to speak up, she whispered. Margaret threatened to put a lien on my house if I complained. Her hands shook as she showed me the threatening letters Margaret had sent her, each one getting nastier than the last. My security camera pinged as I was comforting Mrs. Chun. Margaret was outside, taking photos of my empty driveway while talking on her phone. Using my phone's directional microphone feature, a gift from my tech-savvy daughter, I recorded her words clearly. James, we need to move those cars out of state fast. That judge is asking questions. I pulled up the HOA bylaws on my computer. Section 73 clearly stated that no vehicle may be towed without 30 days, written notice, and 3 separate warnings. None of us had received even one warning. The HOA's own rules required a resident vote for any changes to parking policies. No such vote had ever happened. The next document made my blood run cold. A bank statement showing large cash deposits to Margaret's personal account, right after each car sale. A pattern so obvious, it was almost laughable if it hadn't been so tragic. She wasn't just breaking HOA rules. This was criminal fraud. My doorbell rang again. Ted Rodriguez stood there with 2 other neighbors I recognized from the towing records. Judge Anderson, Ted said, his voice low. We found something you need to see. He pulled out his phone, showing me photos of a hidden lot behind Winters Premium Auto. There sat Mrs. Chin's Corvette, still with her husband's disabled veteran plate, being loaded onto a truck bound for another state. As I copied the evidence and prepared case files, another security alert popped up. Margaret was now putting violation notices on every car parked in driveways on our street. But her face in the camera feed showed something new. Fear. She kept looking over her shoulder, jumping at every sound. She knew someone was watching, but had no idea how much evidence we'd already gathered. I closed my laptop and looked at the group gathered in my living room. Mrs. Chun had stopped crying and sat up straighter. The Garcias held hands, hope returning to their faces. Tomorrow, I told them, we're going to show Margaret exactly what happens when you mess with the wrong judge. But first, I needed to make one more call to my friend at the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. I arrived early to set up the community center for the emergency HOA meeting. My hands were steady as I connected my laptop to the projector, even though my heart was racing. 20 minutes before start time, residents started filing in. Mrs. Chun, who lost her late husband's restored Mustang last month, sat in the front row, clutching a folder of documents. Behind her, the Patels whispered about how their son's first car disappeared just days after he left for college. Margaret strutted in 5 minutes late, wearing a brand-new Gucci dress and heels that probably cost more than some residents' monthly mortgage payments. Her brother-in-law, Steve, slipped into a back corner, trying to look invisible despite his flashy Rolex. The room was packed. I had never seen so many people at an HOA meeting. "Let's make this quick," Margaret announced, tapping her expensive pen on the podium. "Some of us have dinner reservations." "Actually, Margaret," I interrupted, standing up slowly. "This might take a while." I walked to the front of the room, letting my judge's credential card dangle visibly from my lanyard. For those who don't know me, I'm Judge Sarah Anderson from the County Civil Court. The color drained from Margaret's face so fast I thought she might faint. Steve's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, edging toward the door. But Ted Rodriguez was faster. He quietly moved to block the exit. "Today we're going to review some interesting footage," I continued, clicking my remote. The projector hummed to life, showing crystal-clear security camera footage of Margaret directing the tow truck to my driveway at 3 a.m. This is from 2 weeks ago. Notice the timestamp, 3:17 a.m. Now let's look at the HOA bylaws regarding vehicle removal. I clicked again, showing the rules Margaret herself had written. Section 72 clearly states all vehicle removals must occur during daylight hours, with 30 days written notice. More clicks revealed similar nighttime tows from other resident homes. Margaret tried to regain control. These were all legitimate removals of vehicles violating our standards. Like Mrs. Chin's classic Mustang, I asked, pulling up its auction listing. "The one your brother-in-law's dealership sold for $45,000 after buying it at auction for $5,000? I turned to face Steve, but he was already gone, the back door swinging closed behind him. The room erupted with voices as more residents stood up, waving papers and photos of their missing vehicles. Margaret's perfectly manicured nails drummed nervously on the podium as she realized she was losing control. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "I was protecting our property values. These people were breaking rules." "Which rules exactly?" I asked calmly, pulling up more documents, because I have here a copy of the original HOA bylaws from the county recorder's office. They're quite different from the version you've been enforcing. In fact, it seems you've been using an altered version that was never legally ratified. Mrs. Chen stood up, her voice shaking, but determined. "My Henry spent 20 years restoring that car. We had all the proper permits." The Patels joined in. "Our son saved for 3 years to buy his car." Margaret's composure cracked. She grabbed her designer purse and tried to push past Ted, but froze when she saw the news cameras in the hallway. I hadn't mentioned that I'd invited the local media or that Ted was wearing a wire. "Margaret," I said quietly, "I suggest you sit down. We haven't even gotten to the part about the money trail between your personal account and the dealership yet." I picked up my phone. "Also, the FBI agents outside would like a word about crossing state lines with stolen vehicles." Just as I finished showing the security footage, Ted Rodriguez stood up and dropped a bombshell that made everyone gasp. "I'm not just your neighbor," he announced, pulling out his press badge. "I'm an investigative reporter for Channel 7 News, and I've been tracking HOA vehicle theft rings across 3 states. The room erupted in whispers as Ted connected his laptop to the projector. My hands gripped the podium tighter as images flashed across the screen. Dozens of cars, all legally seized by HOAs, all sold through a network of dealerships owned by Margaret's family members. The pattern was crystal clear. Target homes when residents were away, claim bogus violations, then rush the cars to auction before owners could fight back. Mrs. Chun, our elderly neighbor who'd lost her son's restored Mustang last month, broke down in tears as she pointed to her car in one of Ted's photos. It was sitting on a lot in Nevada, repainted and priced at triple its auction value. Next to her, the Patel family recognized their minivan that Margaret had claimed was abandoned while they were visiting relatives in India. Ted pulled up surveillance photos showing Margaret meeting with HOA residents from other communities at expensive restaurants, teaching them how to modify bylaws to make their vehicle seizures appear legal. Bank records revealed kickbacks disguised as consulting fees flowing through shell companies. My judicial experience helped me spot at least 15 federal crimes in the documents Ted had gathered. But what really sent chills through the room was the map Ted displayed next. Red dots showed where cars had been seized. They formed perfect circles around low-income neighborhoods and retirement communities. Margaret had been systematically targeting the most vulnerable residents, counting on them being too intimidated or resource-strapped to fight back. "There's more," Ted said quietly, pulling out a thick folder. "Remember last year's charity car show Margaret organized? Every classic car that was donated had been seized through her scheme. She even wrote herself tax deductions for the donations." As I watched Margaret's face grow paler with each revelation, I noticed her frantically texting under the table. Ted caught my eye and nodded. His team was already monitoring her communications. The evidence was being backed up to secure servers as we spoke. The Rodriguez Children's College Fund car, the Williams family wheelchair van, the Thompsons' delivery vehicle for their small business. All had been sold through Margaret's brother-in-law's dealership network. Each story added another piece to the puzzle, revealing how she had built her designer wardrobe and vacation home on the backs of devastated families. Just then, my phone buzzed with a message from the FBI's white-collar crime division. They'd been waiting for someone with standing to bring a case against Margaret's organization. As a judge who was now a victim, I could finally give them the opening they needed. I looked up at Ted, who smiled and nodded. "Judge Anderson," he said, "I believe it's time to show Margaret what real justice looks like." The room fell silent as Margaret's phone suddenly chirped with an incoming email. My official judicial letterhead requesting all HOA documents be preserved for a federal investigation. The look on her face told me she finally realized she hadn't just messed with a regular homeowner. She had triggered an avalanche that would bury her entire criminal empire. My phone buzzed with a text from Ted at 6 a.m. "Turn on Channel 5 now." I flipped on the TV to see Margaret's brother-in-law's dealership surrounded by news vans. The reporter was holding up a stack of papers, documents I recognized from my own investigation. My hand shook as I watched the story unfold live. Within an hour, my doorbell rang. Margaret stood there in her usual pristine outfit, but her perfectly made-up face couldn't hide her panic. "Judge Anderson, there's been a huge misunderstanding. I can explain everything." She clutched a designer handbag that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments. I invited her in, keeping my voice steady and professional. Ted had secretly set up legal recording equipment in my living room the night before, capturing every word. Margaret's story changed with each sentence, first claiming it was all a computer error, then blaming her brother-in-law, finally suggesting we could work something out privately. That's when I pulled out the files. Pictures of every car she'd taken spread across my coffee table. Bank statements showing the money trail. Statements from elderly victims who'd lost their only means of transportation. Margaret's face turned whiter with each document. "Your brother-in-law sold my Mercedes to the Phillips family in Oklahoma," I said calmly, sliding their purchase agreement across the table. "They're a single-income household with 3 kids who thought they were getting a good deal on a reliable car. Did you think about them when you orchestrated this scheme?" Margaret's composure cracked. "Those people should thank me. I'm maintaining property values. Do you know what cars and driveways do to home prices?" She grabbed her phone, furiously texting someone. Through my window, I watched more news vans arrive. Ted had timed everything perfectly. His exposé was airing across all local stations. Margaret's phone started buzzing nonstop with messages from other HOA board members trying to distance themselves. The final blow came when Mrs. Chun, our 78-year-old neighbor, walked past my window, escorted by her grandson. They were heading to the news vans to tell their story about how Margaret had taken their family's only car while Mrs. Chun was in the hospital. That car had contained her late husband's oxygen tank in the trunk. Margaret's phone rang. Her brother-in-law. I watched her face fall as she listened. He was cutting a deal with investigators, throwing her under the bus to save himself. She jumped up, knocking over her expensive purse. Credit cards spilled out, dozens of them, each registered to a different shell company tied to the stolen cars. As she scrambled to collect them, red and blue lights reflected off my windows. Margaret looked up at me, finally understanding the depth of her situation. "I can make this right," she pleaded. "I can find your car." "It's not about my car anymore," I replied, opening the door as 2 FBI agents walked up my driveway. "It's about every car you've taken, every family you've hurt, and every law you broke thinking you were above them all." The agents read Margaret her rights as my neighbors gathered on their lawns. Some were crying. Others hugged. Ted stood quietly recording everything, while Mrs. Chin's grandson gave me a subtle thumbs up. A small crowd cheered as Margaret was led to the waiting car, still protesting about property values. But this was just the beginning. Margaret was taken away in the back of an FBI vehicle, but the fallout had just begun. By noon, news stations were camped outside the HOA office, demanding statements from board members who suddenly wanted nothing to do with her. Ted's report had gone viral, and phone calls flooded the local station from homeowners across the state, sharing their own horror stories about predatory HOAs. The mayor held an emergency press conference, calling for a full audit of HOA financials across the county. That same afternoon, I received a call from the courthouse. A judge I had known for years was reviewing a petition to freeze all assets connected to Margaret's scheme, including her personal accounts and those of her brother-in-law's dealership. By the time the FBI finished their first round of interrogations, the full scope of the fraud was clear. Margaret had stolen over $3.2 million worth of vehicles in just under 2 years, all under the guise of neighborhood maintenance. Her brother-in-law's dealership had laundered the sales through shell corporations, ensuring that the profits remained hidden. What they hadn't counted on was a community unwilling to stay silent. I spent most of that evening on the phone with former HOA board members who had resigned under Margaret's reign. They shared documents proving she had falsified meeting minutes, fabricated resident complaints, and even rewritten HOA bylaws without proper votes. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was organized crime. Late that night, I received another text from Ted. "Judge Anderson, you need to see this." He attached a screenshot of a classified ad from a car dealership 2 states away. There, listed for $15,000, was my Mercedes, barely disguised with a new paint job. The FBI had already begun tracing where all the stolen cars had ended up, but this was the proof they needed to officially charge Margaret with interstate fraud. The next morning, I drove down to the local FBI field office to give a full statement. As I waited in the lobby, I spotted Margaret's brother-in-law pacing outside an interrogation room. He had already flipped, offering a full confession in exchange for a reduced sentence. He had no loyalty to Margaret. He was willing to testify that she had not only orchestrated the vehicle seizures, but had pressured HOA presidents in other communities to do the same. Before I left the office, an agent handed me a file. Inside were copies of formal charges being prepared against Margaret: fraud, grand theft, wire fraud, conspiracy, and abuse of power. She was facing over 15 years in prison. By the time I returned home, the HOA board had officially voted to remove her as president. A meeting was scheduled for the next evening, where the residents would vote on new leadership. As I pulled into my driveway, I saw Mrs. Chun standing by her front porch, watching the sunset. Her grandson gave me a nod of gratitude. For the first time in months, our neighborhood felt peaceful. But Margaret's story wasn't over yet. Tomorrow's meeting would determine whether Oakwood Estates could rebuild, or whether the corruption had spread deeper than we realized. The HOA meeting was unlike any other. Instead of the usual handful of residents, nearly everyone in the neighborhood packed into the community center. The tension in the room was thick, but there was an undeniable shift in the atmosphere. People were no longer afraid. The board members who had once followed Margaret without question now looked uneasy, as if realizing they might be next in line for scrutiny. I sat near the front, watching as the meeting was called to order. The first agenda item was simple. Margaret was officially removed from the HOA. The motion passed unanimously. A ripple of satisfaction moved through the crowd, but no one was celebrating yet. There was still unfinished business. A tall man in a suit stepped forward. He introduced himself as Agent Collins with the FBI's white-collar crime division. He held up a folder thick with documents and turned to address the residents. What happened in Oakwood Estates was not an isolated event, he began. Over the past 2 years, similar schemes have been uncovered in 12 different neighborhoods, each connected to Margaret Winters or her associates. Gasps filled the room. Agent Collins continued, explaining that Margaret had been indicted on multiple counts of fraud, conspiracy, and grand theft auto, with additional charges still pending. The garage fell silent as he detailed how her brother-in-law's dealership had been seized, how their assets were being liquidated, and how victims, including many sitting in that room, would be able to file claims to recover damages. For the first time, it truly sank in that Margaret wasn't coming back. The homeowners now had a choice: elect new leadership or dissolve the HOA entirely. A heated discussion broke out. Some residents wanted to keep the HOA, but with stricter oversight. Others, still burned from Margaret's corruption, wanted it gone for good. I stayed quiet, letting them debate. It wasn't my place to decide. But when Mrs. Chun stood up, the room quieted. "My Henry loved this neighborhood," she said, her voice steady. "He spent years restoring his car in our driveway, waving to every neighbor who passed. That was what this place was supposed to be. Not rules and punishments, not power trips." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. In the end, the decision was made by vote. The HOA would remain, but under new leadership with built-in legal protections to prevent another Margaret from ever rising again. I was asked to oversee the transition, ensuring transparency and accountability. It wasn't a role I had expected, but after everything, I couldn't say no. As the meeting adjourned, people lingered, shaking hands, reconnecting in a way they hadn't in months. It felt like a weight had lifted from the community. As I stepped outside, Ted approached with a satisfied grin. "So, Judge, think you'll stick around? Or is this neighborhood too dramatic for you now?" I chuckled, glancing at my driveway, finally occupied by my returned Mercedes, courtesy of the FBI's recovery efforts. "I think I'll stay a little longer," I said. "After all, someone has to make sure these new HOA rules don't get out of hand." What would you do if your HOA decided to pull a full-blown police-style raid over something as simple as closing your own driveway? Sounds crazy, right? Well, in this story, an overzealous HOA enforcer, a pretend security squad, and even a K-9 unit all ended up learning the hard way that playing the role of law enforcement doesn't always go as planned. And the best part? None of them had the slightest clue that the person they were messing with was actually the son of the chief of police. Buckle up, because this one is a wild ride. I moved into this suburban neighborhood around 5 years ago, drawn by the idea of a peaceful life away from the constant noise of the city. My house is located about halfway down a gently curving street lined with nearly identical single-family homes. If you've ever seen those old sitcoms with neatly maintained yards and uniform sidewalks, you can picture exactly what my neighborhood looks like. Some houses have kept their traditional white picket fences, while others have updated to sleek metal ones. Perfectly trimmed hedges frame each property, and at least one or two shiny SUVs sit parked in every driveway. On the surface, it seems like the kind of place where people mind their own business and keep things civil, or at least that's what I thought. My home blends in with the rest, but I've added a few small personal touches over the years to make it my own. The shutters are painted a slightly darker shade. Hanging plants sway near the front porch, and a well-kept flower bed greets visitors as they approach the door. Before the whole gate situation, these details had never been an issue. In fact, they had either gone completely unnoticed or received the occasional polite compliment from a neighbor. No big deal. I always made sure that any updates I made aligned with the existing HOA rules, especially after hearing horror stories about nightmare HOAs in other areas. For the first 3 years, everything was relatively calm. If someone's lawn got a little too overgrown, they might receive a friendly reminder. If the paint on a house started to chip, they would get a polite suggestion to touch it up before the next season. Nothing felt too strict or overbearing. Sure, the HOA board members weren't exactly the warmest bunch, but they mostly kept their distance. That all changed about 1.5 years ago when Maria took over as HOA president. And let me tell you, the entire vibe of the neighborhood shifted overnight. Maria is intense. At first, she came off as someone who genuinely wanted to keep the neighborhood looking its best. She talked about property values and maintaining community standards, and at the time, it all seemed reasonable. After all, who wouldn't want to live in a well-kept neighborhood? But as time went on, her leadership became less about maintaining order and more about exerting absolute control. The shift wasn't immediate. It crept in gradually, small rule changes here, new fines there. Over time, more and more people started whispering about the sudden increase in notices for seemingly harmless infractions. Leaving your trash bin out a little too long? Fine. Planting the wrong type of flowers? Violation. Having patio furniture that wasn't explicitly approved? Citation. It didn't take long before homeowners were walking on eggshells, afraid of accidentally triggering Maria's never-ending list of restrictions. By the time I found myself tangled in a fight with her, the tension in the neighborhood had already reached its peak. And what started my battle with Maria? Something so trivial it was almost laughable. People using my driveway as a turnaround spot. Because my house sat on a bend near a busier road, drivers would constantly pull in, back out, and take off like my property was some public intersection. It wasn't just inconvenient. It was outright frustrating. The tire marks, the occasional oil stains, and the weird feeling of random cars pulling up near my living room window at all hours had been grating on me for months. There had even been times when I had to slam on my brakes to avoid colliding with someone who decided to whip into my driveway without warning. After putting up with it for far too long, I decided to put an end to it once and for all. My solution? A simple black sliding gate. Nothing too flashy, nothing over the top. Just a mid-height, functional gate designed to keep random cars from treating my driveway like a public turnaround. I didn't take this decision lightly either. Before even considering the installation, I spent several nights combing through the HOA's bylaws, searching for anything that might prevent me from putting up a gate. I also double-checked the city's building codes to ensure I wasn't violating any municipal regulations. Once I was confident that I was in the clear, I got the necessary permits, hired a reliable contractor, and set a date for installation. The work was done on a Saturday. The crew arrived early, hauling in the materials, metal panels, rolling tracks, an electronic keypad for access. They measured, leveled, and carefully set everything up to ensure the gate would function smoothly. By the afternoon, it was complete. I took a step back, admiring how well it blended with the rest of the property. No more surprise tire tracks, no more near accidents, no more strangers pulling up at all hours. And on top of that, it actually looked good, matching the dark metal accents on my front porch lights and garage handle. I even joked with one of the installers that the HOA would probably be impressed with how seamless it looked. Little did I know, that gate had just put a giant target on my back. The very next morning around 7:30 a.m., I stepped outside to water my recently planted rose bushes. As the water arched over the petals, glistening in the early sunlight, my eyes drifted toward the street. That's when I saw her, Maria. She was standing just across from my house, right by the sidewalk, holding up her phone and snapping pictures of my driveway. She wasn't trying to be discreet either. She adjusted her phone, shifting angles like some sort of real estate photographer, except I knew these pictures weren't for a listing. They were for something else. I paused for a moment, gripping the hose, watching her take shot after shot of my new gate. The quiet morning atmosphere, filled only with the sounds of sprinklers and birds, felt oddly disturbed by the constant clicking of her camera. After a long few seconds, I gave her a polite wave and called out, "Morning, Maria. Everything okay?" I wasn't expecting a warm response, but even I was caught off guard by what happened next. Instead of returning my greeting, she tucked her phone under her arm, shot me a look so sharp it could cut glass, and turned on her heel. Without saying a single word, she stomped away, her expensive sneakers clicking against the pavement with every irritated step. That was the first real moment I felt something was off. Normally, I wouldn't let someone like Maria get under my skin, but I had heard enough stories about her to know that when she set her sights on something, she didn't back down easily. Sure enough, the next morning, I found out just how fast she was willing to act. Sticking out of my mailbox, pinned in place by the red flag, was a bright yellow notice stamped with the official HOA seal. My stomach twisted as I pulled it out, already having a bad feeling about what I was going to read. In bold letters, the notice declared, "HOA violation. Unauthorized modification." My eyes skimmed over the text, irritation building with every word. According to the notice, I had 48 hours to remove the unauthorized metal gate or face immediate fines, with further enforcement measures listed as a vague but ominous threat. Anger surged through me. I had done everything by the book, checked the HOA bylaws, confirmed city regulations, even pulled the necessary permits. My gate was completely within the guidelines. There was even a section in the HOA rules that explicitly stated automatic gates were allowed, provided they matched the surrounding fencing and did not exceed 6 feet in height. My gate checked every box. So, why was I suddenly being hit with a violation notice? After taking a few deep breaths, I decided I wasn't going to react emotionally. I was going to handle this the right way. If Maria had filed the complaint, then I was going to approach her directly, with all my paperwork in hand. Maybe I thought it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe she was relying on outdated rules, or had some concerns that I could clarify. I was determined to talk to her like two reasonable adults and resolve this before it got out of hand. My mother always believed that when dealing with conflict, it helps to bring a peace offering. Her go-to? Homemade cookies. She always said, people have a hard time staying angry when you offer them something sweet. I figured it was worth a shot. So, I spent the afternoon baking a fresh batch of chocolate chip cookies using her tried-and-true recipe. Real butter, semi-sweet chocolate, a dash of sea salt for contrast. They smelled amazing. I packed them in a clear container, tucked my paperwork under my arm, and headed toward Maria's house, fully prepared to have a rational conversation. She lived in a 2-story house at the end of the block, a place that practically looked like an advertisement for the ideal suburban home. The lawn was manicured to perfection, the hedges trimmed with absolute precision, and a perfectly centered welcome mat lay in front of her door. If appearances alone could earn someone the presidency of an HOA, Maria had it locked down. But what stood out even more than the carefully maintained aesthetic was the conspicuous security camera positioned above the front door, aimed directly at anyone who stepped onto the porch. As I approached, the lens on the camera suddenly shifted, the little motor humming as it adjusted to track my movement. Before I could even reach the doorbell, a crackling sound came through the speaker, followed by Maria's voice. Her tone was sharp and uninviting, already filled with hostility, before I even had a chance to speak. She wasted no time getting straight to the point, declaring that she saw me and was documenting everything. The next thing she said made my stomach tighten. She claimed my gate was lowering property values and that she had already submitted her photos to the HOA board. Without even letting me respond, she announced that an emergency meeting was being held the next day to address the issue. I stood there for a moment, still holding the container of freshly baked cookies in one hand and my stack of paperwork in the other. An emergency meeting over a gate that followed every regulation? That seemed completely over the top. Taking a deep breath, I cleared my throat and tried to respond calmly. I let her know that I had all the necessary paperwork to prove that my gate was compliant, hoping she would at least be open to a conversation. She cut me off immediately, her voice flat and dismissive. She told me to leave, saying she was not interested in any excuses. Just like that, the conversation was over before it even started. Defeated, I turned and walked away, my attempts at a civil discussion completely ignored. The cookies, which were meant as a peace offering, remained undelivered, still warm in the container as I made my way back home. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that Maria wasn't just going to let this go. My mind kept running through different scenarios, trying to figure out why she was making such a big deal out of something so minor. Was she really convinced my gate was an issue, or was this about something else entirely? A personal grudge, a power play, a way to remind the neighborhood who was in charge? Determined to be absolutely certain I was in the right, I spent the next several hours going over the HOA bylaws, my permits, and every document related to my gate. By midnight, I had practically memorized every section. There was no doubt. I had followed every rule. But just because I was right didn't mean Maria was going to back down. The real warning sign came later that night. It was around 10 p.m. when my phone buzzed with an alert from my security camera. Expecting to see nothing more than a stray cat or a passing car, I casually opened the app, only to feel my stomach drop. The feed showed Maria and 2 other HOA board members standing in my driveway, flashlights in hand. They were whispering to each other, measuring the dimensions of my driveway and writing things down on clipboards. But what really caught my attention was the small, sleek business card in one of the board members' hands. The camera footage was a little grainy in the dark, but I could still make out the words printed on it: Elite HOA Enforcement Solutions. Something about the name felt off, so I quickly pulled out my phone and typed it into a search engine. Nothing legitimate came up. No official website, no company records, nothing except a few vague mentions in online forums discussing scam security outfits. The more I searched, the more alarm bells started ringing. A reverse lookup of the phone number on the card revealed that it was linked to a man with a history of arrests for impersonating a security officer. That was the moment I realized that whatever was happening, it had gone far beyond a simple HOA dispute. Sure enough, the next morning I received a text from Maria. The message was short but packed with arrogance. Emergency HOA meeting, 9 a.m. sharp, attendance mandatory, and the kicker, bring your checkbook, fine start at $500 per day. My grip tightened around my phone as I read those words. A $500 daily fine over a gate that was completely legal? The sheer audacity was unbelievable. When I arrived at the neighborhood's small clubhouse 15 minutes before the meeting, I found that several of my neighbors had already gathered. Some looked anxious, others curious, probably wondering why Maria had suddenly called for an emergency meeting. Most of them had never even attended one before, let alone been summoned to one on such short notice. As I stepped inside, I immediately noticed that Maria had turned the room into a full-blown presentation space. A projector stood at the front, connected to a laptop, while rows of chairs were neatly arranged facing the makeshift stage. Maria, standing confidently in her usual polished outfit, had her arms crossed as if she were about to unveil the grandest revelation of the century. The two board members who had been snooping around my property the night before stood beside her, setting up what looked like a PowerPoint slideshow. At exactly 9 a.m., Maria cleared her throat dramatically and tapped her laptop, bringing the projector to life. The first slide appeared on the screen in bold letters: the decline of our community standards. My stomach twisted as I took in the exaggerated images that filled the screen. The photos, which looked like they had been pulled from the worst corners of the internet, displayed rundown houses, peeling paint, and trash-covered yards. Not a single one of these images was actually from our neighborhood, but Maria acted as if they were. For the next 10 minutes, she rambled on about how the neighborhood was at risk. She warned that if people were allowed to make unchecked modifications to their properties, it would lead to chaos. She used vague fear-mongering language, implying that one non-conforming structure would open the floodgates for all kinds of unwanted changes. Then, she clicked to the next slide, a side-by-side comparison of what appeared to be normal driveways on one side and, on the other, a heavily manipulated image of my driveway with the gate. In the photoshopped version, my gate looked absurd, taller, bulkier, and somehow more ominous than reality. A few gasps came from the audience, clearly reacting to the doctored images. I stood up, forcing myself to stay composed. I pointed directly at the screen and spoke firmly, saying that the image was not an accurate representation of my gate. I had the paperwork to prove it was compliant, and I was willing to show anyone who wanted to see it. Maria, unfazed, clicked her remote again. A new slide appeared: financial ramifications. A ridiculous bar graph, completely unlabeled with no sources, attempted to show how property values would supposedly plummet if my gate was allowed to stay. The numbers were random percentages with no context, but it was clear that Maria was trying to stir up panic among the homeowners. Then came her final declaration. She announced that the HOA board had unanimously voted to fine me $1,500 per day until the gate was removed. And to make matters worse, she revealed that they had contracted a security firm, West Valley Security Services, to ensure compliance. If I refused to remove the gate, they would escalate. I took a deep breath, suppressing my anger. I wasn't about to be intimidated. I stood up once again and addressed the entire room, raising my voice just enough so that everyone could hear me. I had every necessary permit. The HOA bylaws, specifically Section 7.3, explicitly allowed automatic gates of this type. Mine was within regulation, standing no taller than 6 feet, made of black metal, and in line with the design of the surrounding fences. More importantly, I had never been given prior notice that the gate was not allowed. The violation notice had only appeared after the installation was completed. To back up my point, I pulled out my paperwork and started handing out copies. Some neighbors took them, flipping through the pages, nodding in agreement as they realized I had done everything by the book. Maria slammed her palm on the podium, cutting me off. "The board has decided," she said coldly. "There will be no further discussion. West Valley Security Services has been informed. If the gate is not removed by the end of the week, they will handle enforcement. Her words sent a chill through the room. What did she mean by handle enforcement? Typically, an HOA could issue fines, send notices, or in extreme cases, place a lien on a property. But bringing in a security firm? That was unheard of. I refused to back down. I wasn't going to be bullied. I stated firmly that I would not remove a gate that was legally allowed. If they wanted to fine me, that was their choice, but I would not be paying a single cent for a violation that didn't actually exist. Maria's expression hardened. Then prepare for the consequences, she hissed. The meeting was over, but I had a feeling that this battle was just beginning. After the meeting, I approached one of the more reasonable board members. He stood near the entrance, clutching the paperwork I had handed out during the meeting. His expression was conflicted, like someone who had just realized they were part of something they didn't fully agree with. Lowering my voice, I asked him directly if he really believed this so-called security firm was legitimate. He hesitated before responding, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. He admitted that Maria had insisted on hiring them, claiming that she had worked with them before in another community. But then he dropped a key piece of information. There had never been an official vote. The board hadn't formally approved the hiring of West Valley Security Services. Maria had unilaterally decided to bring them in, stating that the situation required immediate action. That was all I needed to hear. I pressed further, asking if the board had been given any documentation proving that this firm was legitimate. He swallowed hard and shook his head. Maria had handled everything. There had been no review process, no verification of credentials, nothing. The more I heard, the more convinced I became that something was seriously wrong. I thanked him for his honesty and left, my mind racing. In an ideal world, I would have been able to rally the entire neighborhood on the spot, showing them the truth and turning the tide against Maria. But HOAs were tricky. Some people were afraid to push back, worried that they would become the next target. Others simply didn't care, preferring to stay out of conflicts altogether. I briefly considered contacting a lawyer, but I held off, at least for now. My father was the chief of police, but I hadn't told him about any of this yet. I wanted to handle it on my own, believing that logic and facts would ultimately win out. I still had faith in the system, thinking that once Maria realized she had no legal basis for her actions, she would be forced to back down. I could not have been more wrong. The next morning, at exactly 7 a.m., my phone started buzzing with alerts from my security camera system. Groggy from sleep, I reached for my phone, expecting to see a notification about a stray animal or a passing jogger. Instead, what I saw made my stomach drop. 3 black SUVs were parked directly in front of my house. Each one had the words HOA enforcement plastered in large white letters across the side. At least 6 individuals were outside, dressed in matching black uniforms, cargo pants, and boots. Security was printed in bold letters across their shirts, each of them wearing a cheap-looking badge. One of them even had a large German Shepherd on a leash, the dog barking aggressively as if ready to charge. And right in the middle of them, standing with her phone raised and recording everything, was Maria. I sat up instantly, my heart pounding. I swiped through my security camera feeds, trying to process what was happening. One of the uniformed men pounded on my front door with his fist, his voice booming through the intercom. He demanded that I open up immediately, stating that this was my final warning. If I refused to remove the gate, they would take action themselves. I clenched my jaw, adrenaline flooding my system. Forced to take action? Over a gate? I switched to another camera angle, zooming in on their vehicles. The more I examined them, the more I noticed red flags. There were no official license plates, just paper placeholders taped to the back windows. Their badges looked fake, too polished and plastic-like. The entire setup screamed amateur. Then it clicked. These were the same people connected to that shady business card I had seen in my driveway the other night. They weren't a real security firm. They were a group of frauds playing dress-up, hoping to intimidate me into submission. I activated my intercom and spoke through the camera's microphone. My voice was steady but firm. I asked them who they were and demanded to see legal documentation proving they had any authority to be on my property. Maria cut in before any of them could answer. Her voice dripped with condescension as she told me I had ignored multiple warnings and that this was the final step. If I didn't remove my so-called eyesore of a gate immediately, these men would do it for me. One of the men walked toward the SUV and pulled out what looked like a massive pair of bolt cutters. Another patted the dog, muttering something under his breath. That was it. I wasn't about to let this go any further. I grabbed my phone and scrolled through my contacts, my fingers moving on instinct. When my father answered, his voice was calm, but I could tell he instantly knew something was wrong. I kept my explanation short, telling him that an unverified security group had just shown up at my house, armed with bolt cutters and AK-9 unit, demanding that I remove my gate. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before his voice shifted into full police mode. Stay inside. Lock your doors. Do not engage them. Backup is on the way. I hung up and turned my attention back to the security camera feeds. Outside, the men were getting impatient. One of them banged on my door again, the German Shepherd pulling hard at its leash. I took a deep breath and spoke through the microphone one last time. This is private property. You are trespassing. I have called the police. If you do not leave immediately, you will be facing real legal consequences. A flicker of uncertainty crossed one of the men's faces, but Maria wasn't backing down. She crossed her arms and smirked, calling out that no one was above the rules. Not even me. I steadied my breathing, because the real law was about to arrive. Just as one of the men stepped forward with a power tool, where he got it so quickly, I had no idea I heard it. The distant wail of approaching sirens. My heart pounded as blue and red lights flickered at the far end of the street. Within moments, a marked police cruiser pulled up behind the SUVs, blocking them in. The so-called security officers immediately froze, exchanging uneasy glances. Maria, however, was still standing tall, her phone raised high as she continued to record, her smirk unwavering. It was as if she still believed she had the upper hand, as if she thought she was completely in the right. The driver's side door of the cruiser opened, and out stepped my father, Chief Gary Williams. His presence alone shifted the entire atmosphere. Dressed in his full uniform, he walked toward the group with a practiced authority, his expression unreadable. He had been in law enforcement for years, and this wasn't the first time he had dealt with people pretending to have power they didn't actually possess. His voice carried across the yard, calm yet firm. He introduced himself, his badge gleaming under the morning light, and with a single, unwavering command, he told them all to stand down immediately. Maria visibly stiffened, her phone dipping slightly as she processed what was happening. One of the so-called security officers took a cautious step back, likely realizing that the situation had turned against them in an instant. My father scanned the scene, his sharp gaze lingering on the bolt cutters, the fake security badges, and the aggressive German Shepherd that was still pulling at its handler's leash. Then, without breaking stride, he stopped in front of the man holding the power tool. "Put that down," my father instructed coolly, "and show me your credentials, if you have any." The man hesitated, his grip tightening around the tool for a moment before slowly lowering it. "We were contracted by the HOA," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. My father didn't blink. "Your license," he repeated. "Your bond papers. Your private security registration. Anything official." The silence that followed was deafening. One by one, the so-called security officers either shrugged or fumbled through their pockets, attempting to pull out random scraps of paper that looked anything but official. Two of them had cheap plastic badges that bore no real insignia, and the dog handler had no identification at all. The entire operation was unraveling before their eyes. "That's enough," my father finally said, his tone shifting. "You're all under investigation for impersonating licensed security personnel. Do not make any sudden moves." Behind him, two uniformed officers stepped forward, Paul and Kenneth, each taking a pair of handcuffs from their belts. Maria, now visibly nervous, took a small step backward, her smug expression faltering. But just as she turned, trying to slip away quietly, Officer Kenneth called out to her, "Ma'am, please stay where you are." Her head snapped up, panic flickering in her eyes for the first time. She squared her shoulders, her voice rising. "But I'm the HOA president. They're in violation. We were just enforcing the rules." My father looked at her, unimpressed. HOA rules don't override state or county law, he stated. You cannot hire unlicensed security to carry out a forced removal. This is far beyond your authority. Maria opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Her face had gone pale, her confidence evaporating as the reality of the situation sank in. Inside my house, I finally exhaled, relief flooding through me. Even though I had been standing my ground, there was no denying that having a group of uniformed strangers pounding on my door had been terrifying. But now, watching as the real law stepped in, the balance of power had shifted entirely. By the time it was all over, the situation had unfolded at lightning speed. The fake security officers were handcuffed and placed in the back of the squad cars, facing a range of charges from trespassing to impersonating security personnel. The German Shepherd, clearly just following orders, was taken into custody by animal control, ensuring its safety until its rightful owner could be identified. Maria stood stiffly off to the side, arms crossed, her entire body tense as she watched the scene unfold. Then, Officer Kenneth approached her once again. "We need you to come down to the station for questioning regarding the hiring of these individuals," he said firmly. "There's reason to believe HOA funds may have been misused." Maria's mask cracked. "I only did what was necessary to maintain community standards. We had a board vote," she stammered. "We have a right to enforce the rules." My father gestured toward the unmarked SUVs with the fake HOA enforcement stickers. "You do not have the right to authorize what amounts to a private militia on someone's property without legal grounds. And by the way, these vehicles aren't even properly registered." Maria turned to me then, her expression a mixture of fury and desperation. "I hope you're happy now," she spat. "This is your fault. Refusing to follow the rules and undermining community values." I shook my head in disbelief. Even now, as she stood on the verge of total legal ruin, she was still trying to spin the narrative to make me the villain. But it didn't matter anymore. Her reign was over. Later that same day, news of the raid spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Phones rang nonstop, texts flooded in, and local message boards lit up with discussions about what had just unfolded. By evening, nearly everyone in the community had heard the story. Maria had hired a group of fake security officers to forcibly remove a legally compliant gate, and she had been caught red-handed when the police arrived. People speculated about how she had funded it, whether she had misused HOA money, and how many rules she had broken in the process. The remaining HOA board members scrambled to contain the damage, calling an emergency meeting of their own. But this time, it was a real emergency. When I arrived at the meeting, the energy in the room was completely different from before. There were no smug presentations, no scare tactics, no doctored images. Instead, there was frustration, anger, and a growing demand for accountability. Neighbors who had previously remained silent were now speaking up, sharing their own grievances. One couple revealed that Maria had threatened them with fines for something as absurd as having a recycling bin visible for too long. Another elderly homeowner admitted that she had been forced to repaint her house after Maria claimed the color wasn't in line with the HOA's vision. Story after story came out, each one painting a picture of a leader who had been abusing her power long before she set her sights on me. The turning point came when someone demanded to see the financial records, questioning whether Maria had illegally funneled HOA funds into hiring the so-called security team. The room fell into hushed whispers as the board members exchanged nervous glances. Then, without hesitation, one member called for an immediate vote to remove Maria as president. The decision was unanimous. Just like that, Maria was stripped of her authority, her reign over the neighborhood collapsing in a matter of minutes. But it wasn't just her title she lost. Soon after, a full-scale audit of the HOA's finances was announced, with board members vowing to investigate exactly how much money had been misused. The legal consequences of her actions weren't far behind either. With the police already involved, she was facing real scrutiny, and word quickly spread that she might even have to pay back every penny she had taken from the HOA's budget. Within days, Maria went from being the most feared figure in the community to a complete outcast. The same people who once whispered about her now openly condemned her. It wasn't long before a for sale sign appeared in front of her picture-perfect house, signaling that she was leaving the neighborhood for good. A few months later, she was gone. No farewell messages, no final power plays. Just an empty house and the lingering memory of what had once been her iron-fisted rule. And my gate? It stayed. No more violation notices, no more threats, and certainly no more fake security teams showing up at my doorstep with bolt cutters and AK-9 unit. In the days that followed Maria's removal, the entire neighborhood seemed to breathe easier. People who had once been too afraid to challenge her started making small changes to their homes. New flower beds, decorative lighting, even a few backyard renovations that had previously been deemed unauthorized by Maria's ever-changing standards. The HOA, now under new leadership, quickly backtracked on the absurd fine she had issued, refunding the homeowners who had been unfairly charged. As for me, I went about my life as usual, but with a newfound appreciation for standing my ground. If there was one thing this whole ordeal had taught me, it was that some people, when given power, will do anything to keep it, even if it means stepping far outside the bounds of legality. Maria had underestimated me. She had assumed that I would cave under pressure, that I would simply accept her authority without question. What she didn't count on was the fact that I had done my homework, that I had the law on my side, and more importantly, that I wasn't someone who could be intimidated into submission. Looking back, it still amazed me how far she had been willing to go over something as simple as a gate. But in the end, her downfall wasn't about a gate at all. It was about her own arrogance, her obsession with control, and her inability to see the line between power and abuse. It wasn't long before her house was bought by a new family, a couple with 2 young kids who had no idea about the drama that had unfolded there. Life moved on, the neighborhood settled back into normalcy, and for the first time in years, it actually felt like a community again. And my gate? It became more than just a barrier to keep cars from using my driveway. It became a symbol of standing up for what's right, of not letting someone bully you just because they hold a title. The best part? Every time I pulled into my driveway, I got to see that gate still standing, right where it belonged. Amanda Clark never wanted problems. She had spent most of her life avoiding unnecessary disputes, preferring to focus on her work rather than meddling in arguments. After inheriting her father's house, she had one mission: preserve his legacy. The house itself was nothing special, just a modest, well-built home with an attached garage that had been her father's workshop for decades. It wasn't just a garage. It was a sanctuary filled with high-end tools, specialized gear, and rare components that he had collected over the years. Her father, Robert Clark, had been a skilled mechanic, known for restoring classic American muscle cars to their original glory. When he passed away, Amanda found herself not just the owner of his property, but the keeper of his craft. She had no intention of letting all of his efforts disappear, and so she stepped into his shoes, continuing the meticulous restoration projects he had once taken on. She wasn't running a business, at least not officially. She worked on cars in her spare time, taking in projects from collectors who appreciated her father's expertise, which she had inherited. The neighborhood, however, was changing. A few years prior, a new group had taken control of the Homeowners Association, turning what was once a simple committee into something closer to a corporate watchdog. The rules became stricter, fines were handed out for the smallest issues, and longtime residents who had once lived peacefully now found themselves dealing with an increasingly controlling set of board members. Amanda had mostly ignored their changes, confident that she wasn't doing anything wrong. But when she received her first violation notice, she realized that ignorance was not going to shield her. The letter stated that her garage was being used for commercial purposes and that this violated zoning laws, despite the fact that she wasn't advertising her work or even having a frequent influx of customers. The language in the letter was unclear, filled with citations of bylaws and legal terms that didn't seem to have a direct connection to her situation. She consulted a lawyer, who assured her that as long as she wasn't operating a full-fledged business with signage, employees, or daily foot traffic, she wasn't breaking any laws. Amanda responded to the violation notice with a formal statement, explaining that she was merely working on personal projects, not conducting a business. The response was ignored. A second letter arrived a week later, this time claiming that she was in violation of property aesthetics rules because she had multiple non-operational vehicles parked on her property. This was another ridiculous claim. Yes, she had a few cars in various stages of restoration, but they were parked inside her fenced yard, not rusting away in plain sight. It was obvious that this wasn't about rule enforcement. It was about targeting her. She began to notice strange occurrences around her property. A car parked down the street at odd hours, someone walking past her house just a little too slowly, their eyes scanning her garage rather than minding their business. She brushed it off as paranoia at first, but when she found deep scratches on her garage lock one morning, she knew she wasn't imagining things. Someone had tried to break in. Amanda replaced the locks with reinforced versions, the kind that required industrial tools to cut through. She also installed security cameras, but something bizarre happened 2 nights later. They stopped functioning for a full hour. When she checked the footage, the entire duration was missing. No glitches, no corrupt files, just a clean gap in the recording. Someone had disabled them. She called the police, but they shrugged it off, saying that without evidence of an actual crime, there wasn't much they could do. Then came the night she heard noises. It was just past midnight when a faint metallic clatter reached her ears from outside. Her bedroom window overlooked the driveway, and when she peeked through the curtains, she saw shadows moving near the garage. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. But before she could even press call, the figures vanished into the darkness. When she went outside with a flashlight, the garage door was still locked, but the handle had been twisted slightly, as if someone had been trying to force it open. The next morning, she found a letter taped to her door. No envelope, no postage, just a plain sheet of paper with a message typed in an almost clinical font. You are in repeated violation of community standards. Further action will be taken. Amanda clenched her fists as she read it. They weren't just fining her anymore. They were making threats. That was when she decided she couldn't handle this alone. She picked up the phone and called her uncle Henry Clark. Henry had been a police officer for over 25 years before retiring, and he had seen more corruption in his career than he cared to admit. When Amanda explained everything that had happened, the notices, the harassment, the tampering with her cameras, he didn't hesitate. I'm coming over, he said. By the time Henry arrived that evening, Amanda had already gone over every piece of evidence she had. Security footage, what little there was left of it, the violation letters, the scratch locks. Henry took one look at the latest letter and exhaled sharply. This isn't some bored neighborhood committee trying to enforce rules. Someone's trying to push you out. Why? Amanda asked. It's just a garage. I'm not breaking any laws. Henry shook his head. It's not about the rules. Someone wants this property, and they're trying to scare you into leaving. Amanda didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore the pattern. If they wanted her gone, the fines weren't working, and neither were the threats, which meant whoever was behind this was going to escalate. She didn't have to wait long for that to happen. 2 days later, Amanda returned from work to find her garage door wide open. Panic shot through her chest as she rushed across the driveway, her heart pounding at the thought of what she might find. The heavy-duty lock, the one she had reinforced, was completely gone, the metal twisted as if it had been pried open with force. Her father's meticulously organized workshop looked like a storm had hit it. Tools were scattered, drawers had been pulled out, and expensive equipment was missing. The sight made her stomach turn. This wasn't a simple break-in. Someone had searched for something. She immediately called Henry, who arrived within minutes, his face hard as he scanned the damage. Amanda, take a deep breath, he said, placing a hand on her shoulder. I need you to tell me exactly what's missing. She went through the inventory, realizing the most valuable tools had been taken, things that weren't just expensive, but irreplaceable. Whoever had done this knew what they were looking for. Henry knelt near the door, running his fingers along the frame. This wasn't a random burglary, he muttered. They knew exactly when to strike. Amanda's hands curled into fists. This wasn't about HOA rules anymore. This was personal. Henry stood, his eyes narrowed. Time to set up some real security. That night, they installed motion sensors, additional cameras, and reinforced every entry point. If whoever did this came back, they wouldn't get away so easily. But Amanda couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The next morning, Amanda found a fresh violation notice taped to her door. Her jaw clenched as she ripped it off, scanning the text with growing frustration. This time, the HOA claimed that her garage was in violation of community safety standards, citing concerns over stored chemicals and hazardous equipment. Amanda's stomach turned. They had escalated again. This wasn't about rules. They were creating excuses to justify what had happened. She stormed into her house, slamming the notice onto the table in front of Henry, who was already reviewing the footage from the previous night. "They're covering their tracks," she snapped. "First, they break in, now they're trying to make it official." Henry sighed, rubbing his temples. "We need to find out who's behind this." Amanda took a breath, trying to think. If this was about the property, then someone stood to gain from her leaving. She pulled out the HOA records and started digging. Within an hour, she found something. The association had recently approved a rezoning proposal, one that would allow commercial development on certain residential lots. Her house was right in the middle of it. Her gut twisted. This wasn't just harassment. This was a scheme. Henry looked over her shoulder, his face darkening. "They're trying to force you out so they can sell this land at a profit." Amanda's hands shook as she gripped the documents. If that was true, then the break-in was just the beginning. Amanda knew she couldn't fight this battle alone, so she decided to go to the HOA meeting in person. She walked into the hall, her head held high, refusing to let them see any hesitation. The board members sat at the front, their expressions unreadable, but the moment she stepped inside, a hush fell over the room. Victoria Hayes, the HOA president, adjusted her glasses and cleared her throat. "Miss Clark," she said, her tone carefully measured. "This meeting is for official business." Amanda strode forward, placing the violation notices onto the table with a thud. "Then let's talk business," she replied. "I want to know why I keep getting these notices, especially after my garage was broken into." The murmur in the room grew louder, but Victoria remained calm, folding her hands neatly on the table. "The rules must be enforced," she stated. "Your property has violations, and we are ensuring compliance." Henry, who had come with her, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And what about the security footage showing people tampering with her garage?" The board members exchanged glances, but Victoria kept her smile. "If you have evidence, you are free to file a report with the police." Amanda's blood boiled, but she forced herself to stay calm. She reached in her bag, pulling out the rezoning documents. "Then explain this," she challenged. The moment the papers hit the table, the room fell silent. The HOA board members shifted, their faces tensing. Amanda's heart pounded. She had just thrown the first punch in a much bigger fight. Victoria's smile faltered for the first time, and Amanda knew she had struck a nerve. The other board members exchanged glances, their once confident expressions now uneasy. Victoria picked up the documents, skimming them with an air of forced indifference. "Miss Clark," she began, her tone measured. "This is a misunderstanding. The HOA's involvement in rezoning discussions is purely advisory." Amanda folded her arms, her stare unwavering. "Then why have I been targeted? Why the harassment?" Victoria set the papers down, lacing her fingers together. "If you feel wronged, there are proper channels for your concerns." Henry let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "That's funny, because the only proper channel I see is a federal investigation." The room went silent, tension thick as smoke. Amanda placed a USB drive onto the table. "This is all the footage, all the letters, and all the financial records I've collected. It goes to the authorities tomorrow, unless you have a better explanation." Victoria's face stiffened, but her eyes flickered with something Amanda recognized: fear. She wasn't in control anymore. The board members shifted uncomfortably, whispers breaking out among the residents. Victoria smoothed her blazer, forcing a smile. "I see no need for hostility," she said lightly. "Perhaps we can discuss this further in a more appropriate setting." Amanda leaned forward, her voice low. "I think we just did." The next morning, Amanda received an email from the HOA, claiming her violations had been dropped. She read the message twice, unable to believe the sudden change. Just yesterday, they had been adamant about enforcing their so-called rules, and now they were backing down. Henry, sitting across the table, smirked as he sipped his coffee. "They're scared," he said. "They know you have them cornered." Amanda wasn't convinced. It felt too easy. She replied to the email, requesting a formal confirmation, but before she could hit send, there was a knock at the door. When she opened it, a man in a suit stood there, his posture rigid. "Miss Clark," he greeted, extending a card. "I'm Richard Hastings, the HOA's legal counsel." Amanda glanced at Henry, who set his mug down, stepping to her side. "What can I do for you?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Hastings adjusted his tie. "The board would like to offer a resolution," he said. "If you withdraw your complaints, we'll ensure no further action is taken against your property." Amanda's stomach tightened. This wasn't an apology. This was a bribe. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. "So, you harass her for weeks, try to break into her garage, and now you want to make it all disappear?" Hastings didn't flinch. "We simply want to resolve this peacefully." Amanda folded her arms. "The problem is I don't trust you." Hastings sighed, pulling a folder from his briefcase. "Then perhaps you should see what's at stake." Amanda took the folder, flipping it open, and her blood ran cold. Inside were detailed records, maps of her property, notes on her routine, and even photographs of her garage taken from different angles. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was targeted surveillance. Her hands tightened around the pages as she looked up at Hastings, her stomach churning. "What is this?" she demanded. Hastings remained calm, adjusting his cufflinks. "Just documentation," he said, "to ensure all community standards are being upheld." Henry let out a slow, controlled breath, his eyes narrowed. "You've been spying on her. This isn't regulation, this is stalking." Hastings didn't react, but there was a hint of discomfort in his expression. Amanda forced herself to stay composed, even as her pulse raced. "And if I don't take the deal?" Hastings folded his hands, his tone even. "Then I can't guarantee what happens next." Amanda closed the folder, feeling the weight of what she was holding. They weren't just pushing her out. They were threatening her. But they had underestimated one thing. She wasn't alone in this fight. She looked at Henry, whose jaw had tightened. "We'll be in touch," she said coolly, stepping back into the house. As soon as the door closed, she turned to Henry, her voice firm. "We take this higher." Amanda spent the next day contacting lawyers, city officials, and local journalists. She compiled every document, violation notice, and recorded conversation, making sure her case was airtight. Henry, working beside her, made a few calls to his old colleagues in law enforcement. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was a full-scale investigation. By the afternoon, Amanda had secured a meeting with a local investigative reporter. When she laid out the evidence, the reporter's eyes widened. "This is more than just harassment," he muttered. "This could be a major corruption scandal." Amanda's heart pounded. "That's what I suspect," she said, "but I need it to be proven." The reporter promised to dig deeper, reaching out to other homeowners who had faced similar issues. Meanwhile, Henry had managed to pull property records from the county, and what they found was shocking. The HOA had been secretly transferring ownership of foreclosed homes to a shell company linked to Victoria. Amanda's stomach churned. They weren't just forcing people out. They were profiting from it. That night, Amanda and Henry laid out everything they had gathered, preparing for the next step. "We take this to the state," Henry said. "We're not just exposing them. We're taking them down." Amanda nodded, determination settling into her bones. If the HOA wanted a fight, they had just lost before it had truly begun. The following morning, Amanda woke up to the sound of tires screeching outside her house. She jolted upright, heart pounding, and rushed to the window. A black SUV had just sped away, leaving behind a thick trail of dust. Amanda's stomach churned as she stepped onto the porch, her eyes scanning the area for any signs of what had happened. Henry was already outside, his jaw tight as he looked around. "They're getting desperate," he muttered. Amanda's eyes landed on something unsettling, a large envelope placed neatly at the foot of her door. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers trembling slightly. Inside were printed photos of her walking to her garage, sitting in a cafe, talking to her lawyer. The message was clear. Someone was watching her. Henry snatched the photos, his face darkening. "This isn't just intimidation anymore," he growled. "This is a threat." Amanda took a slow breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "We already know they're corrupt. This just proves how far they're willing to go." But Henry wasn't satisfied. "We need to go to law enforcement," he said firmly. Before she could respond, her phone rang. It was a reporter she had met the day before. "Amanda, you need to see this," he said, his voice urgent. "We've connected the dots, and it's bigger than we thought." Amanda and Henry rushed to the news station, ready to see what the reporter had uncovered. As they stepped into the office, the tension in the air was thick. The reporter, a man in his late 40s, gestured toward a large board covered in documents, photographs, and timelines. "We've been digging," he said, "and what we found isn't just local HOA corruption. It's a statewide scheme." Amanda felt her stomach drop as she examined the board. Dozens of names, addresses, and financial records connected to a network of fraudulent property transfers. Henry let out a low whistle. "This is organized," he said. "Not just a few people being greedy. This is systematic." The reporter nodded, pulling up emails and bank transfers on his screen. "The HOA has been forcibly removing homeowners under false pretenses, then selling the properties at inflated prices through shell companies." Amanda's fingers tightened into fists. "And Victoria is at the center of it?" The reporter exhaled, nodding. "Not just her, but she's a key player. She's been managing the HOA's legal side, making sure the paperwork looks legitimate while homeowners are forced out." Amanda's head spun. This wasn't just about her garage. This was about dozens, maybe hundreds of families who had been pushed out of their homes. Henry crossed his arms. "So, what's our move?" The reporter leaned forward, his eyes serious. "We go public." Amanda knew going public would put a target on her back, but she was done being afraid. She had spent weeks dealing with threats, break-ins, and harassment, but now she had the truth on her side. The next morning, the reporter aired the investigation, exposing the HOA's illegal schemes. The broadcast included interviews with homeowners who had been forced out, financial documents showing suspicious transactions, and even hidden footage of HOA members discussing their deals. Amanda watched as the video spread like wildfire across social media, residents in her neighborhood sharing it, commenting, and demanding action. Within hours, city officials announced a full investigation into the HOA's practices. Victoria, who had always carried herself with confidence, was now nowhere to be seen. Amanda knew she had struck a nerve, but just as she started to feel a sense of relief, Henry called her from his car, his voice urgent. "Amanda," he said, his tone serious. "We got a problem." She gripped her phone, her heart pounding. "What is it?" Henry took a breath, his voice low. "Someone just followed me from the station. I think we've pushed them too far." Amanda had thought the worst was over, but as she sat in her living room, watching the breaking news, she realized this was just the beginning. The federal investigation was now in full swing, and Victoria had been arrested, but there were still too many unanswered questions. Henry sat across from her, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "Amanda, you know this isn't just about the HOA anymore," he said, his voice low. She nodded, eyes fixed on the television. The footage showed agents carrying boxes of documents from the HOA office, loading them into black SUVs. "What do you think they'll find?" she asked. Henry exhaled, rubbing his chin. If what Hastings gave us is accurate, this was way bigger than just Victoria. She wasn't working alone. Amanda's phone buzzed on the coffee table. She picked it up and saw a message from the reporter who had helped expose the corruption. "Meet me at the station. You need to see this." Amanda glanced at Henry, who had seen the text over her shoulder. "I don't like it," he said. "What if someone's watching you?" Amanda clenched her jaw. "We've come this far. I'm not stopping now." 20 minutes later, they arrived at the news station. The reporter waved them into a dimly lit room lined with file cabinets and stacks of papers. "I pulled more records," he said, motioning for them to sit. "This isn't just about forced evictions. They were laundering money, big money." Amanda's stomach twisted. "How big?" The reporter pulled out a document. "Enough to fund major land development projects. And guess who's been backing them?" He slid the paper toward them. Amanda picked it up, her eyes widening as she read the name. "Councilman Richard Warner." Henry let out a low whistle. "That explains a lot. The city's been turning a blind eye to this mess because the guy in charge was profiting from it." Amanda felt her pulse quicken. "We have to take this to the state." The reporter leaned forward. "That's the problem. Warner has friends in high places. If we go to the wrong people, this whole thing gets buried." Henry tapped his fingers against the table, deep in thought. We need undeniable proof, something that forces their hand. The reporter pulled out another file. This is what we have so far. Emails, bank transactions, testimonies from other homeowners. But we need someone who is on the inside. Amanda's mind raced. Hastings. He flipped. He might be willing to testify. Henry nodded. If we can get him on record, we have a real shot at taking this all the way. They left the station, their next move clear. Find Hastings before someone else did. Amanda felt the weight of everything pressing down on her, but she also felt something else, determination. They weren't just fighting for her home anymore. They were fighting for every homeowner who had been pushed out, manipulated, or silenced. And they weren't backing down. Tracking down Hastings wasn't going to be easy, but Amanda knew they didn't have a choice. If he had flipped once, it meant he was scared, and scared people either ran or tried to cut deals. Henry drove as Amanda scrolled through her phone, searching for any trace of him. He'd been careful. No social media presence, no recent business listings. He knew how to stay off the radar. We need another angle, she muttered. Henry nodded. I might know someone who can help. He pulled into a small diner on the outskirts of town, a place Amanda had never been. The neon sign flickered overhead, casting a faint glow on the cracked pavement. Inside, a man sat alone at a booth near the back, stirring a cup of coffee. His graying hair and sharp eyes made it clear he wasn't just some random customer. Henry led Amanda over. This is Carter, he said. He used to run investigations on financial crimes before he retired. Carter looked Amanda up and down before nodding at Henry. What's the job? Henry slid the documents onto the table. We need to find someone who doesn't want to be found. Carter skimmed the pages, his eyes narrowing at the name Hastings. Amanda watched as he pulled out a small notebook, jotting something down. This guy was a lawyer, right? That means he had to register his practice somewhere. Even if he shut everything down, there's always a paper trail. He pulled out his phone and made a call, speaking in hushed tones before hanging up. I might have something, he said, sliding out of the booth. Come on. They followed him out of the diner and into a parking lot, where he leaned against his car and lit a cigarette. Hastings rented a place under a different name, but it's still his. It's about 20 minutes from here. Amanda felt her pulse quicken. If they could get to him before someone else did, they had a real chance of bringing this whole thing down. Let's go, she said. The drive was tense, each turn making Amanda's stomach twist. When they reached the address, a small, run-down motel, Henry parked a few spaces away. They sat in silence for a moment, scanning the lot. No black SUVs. No signs of trouble. Yet, Amanda exhaled. I'll go in. Henry shook his head. No way. If this goes south, you're not in a position to handle it. Amanda shot him a look. And you are? Henry smirked. I have experience. Stay here. She hated it, but she knew he was right. Henry got out and approached the motel, his steps casual but alert. Amanda watched as he disappeared inside, her fingers tapping anxiously against her knee. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours before the door swung open again. Henry emerged with Hastings at his side, looking rattled but alive. Get in, Henry ordered as he slid into the driver's seat. Hastings climbed into the back, glancing nervously out the window. Amanda turned to face him. We need your testimony. Hastings swallowed hard. You don't understand. They're watching everything. If I talk, I disappear. Amanda's jaw tightened. You think staying quiet is safer? They're going down, whether you help or not. The only question is, do you want to go down with them? Hastings ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. If I do this, I need full immunity. Henry met his eyes in the rearview mirror. That's up to the feds. But if you cooperate, you've got a shot. Hastings hesitated before nodding. Fine, I'll do it. But we need to move fast. Amanda glanced at Henry, feeling the weight of what they were about to do. This was it, the final step in bringing the whole operation down. Amanda didn't waste a second. She called the lead investigator and set up the meeting. Hastings sat in the back seat, his fingers tapping nervously against his knee as Henry drove. Are you sure this is safe? Hastings asked, his voice strained. Amanda glanced at Henry, who kept his eyes on the road. Nothing is safe anymore, she muttered. But this is the only way out. They pulled into a secured parking lot behind the federal building. The moment they stepped out, two agents approached, their expressions unreadable. Henry flashed his badge. His old connections still held weight. "We have information," he said, "and a witness." The agents nodded, motioning for them to follow. Inside, they were led to a conference room where a woman in a dark suit sat waiting. Amanda recognized her as Agent Ramirez, the lead investigator on the case. She gestured to the chair across from her. "Sit," she said firmly. "Start from the beginning." Hastings swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. "I was hired to handle legal paperwork for the HOA," he began. "At first, it was basic, enforcing rules, filing complaints. But then things changed. They started targeting specific homeowners, making up violations to force them out." Amanda watched as he detailed how the HOA had been working with developers, secretly flipping foreclosed properties for profit. He provided names, documents, and even a recording of Victoria discussing kickbacks. Ramirez listened carefully, then tapped her pen against the table. "This is damning evidence," she said. "But if we don't act carefully, these people will disappear before we can arrest them." Henry leaned forward. "What's the plan?" Ramirez exhaled. "We go tonight. Federal agents are already stationed near the HOA headquarters. We have enough to issue warrants." Amanda felt a chill run down her spine. This was really happening. Hastings shifted uneasily. "And what about me? I gave you everything." Ramirez nodded. "You'll be placed under protection until the case is closed. But you better hope your testimony holds up in court." Henry checked his watch. "If they're moving tonight, we should be there." Amanda's stomach twisted. They had been fighting this battle for weeks, and now the final move was about to be made. Amanda stood outside the federal building, watching the agents prepare for the raid. The tension in the air was thick, the weight of everything they had uncovered pressing down on her. Henry stood beside her, arms crossed, his sharp eyes scanning the movements of the task force. "This is it," he muttered. "They either run or they fall." She nodded, gripping her phone tightly. The news was already spreading. Reporters had gathered near the HOA headquarters, waiting for the moment federal agents made their move. This wasn't going to be quiet. This was going to be loud. Inside the building, Agent Ramirez gave the final instructions. The warrants had been approved, and within the next hour, arrests would begin. Amanda and Henry were escorted to a nearby observation post, where they could watch everything unfold without being in the middle of it. As the clock ticked, Amanda's nerves were on edge. Then, just as the sun set, the first team moved in. From her vantage point, she saw federal agents storm into the HOA office, their presence commanding. Victoria was the first to be taken into custody, her normally composed expression now filled with shock and anger. As they handcuffed her, she screamed something at the officers, but no one was listening anymore. Then came the developers. One by one, the men behind the fraud were rounded up, some trying to protest, others too stunned to react. Amanda watched, her heart pounding, as they were all placed into waiting vehicles. "It's over," Henry said, exhaling slowly. Amanda felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was bittersweet. This fight had cost her a lot, time, stress, and sleepless nights, but it was finally done. Ramirez approached them, her expression unreadable. "You both did a hell of a job," she said. "Without you, this case would have been buried." Amanda gave a small nod. "We just wanted the truth to come out." Henry smirked. "And a little justice, too." Ramirez chuckled. "Well, you got both. The evidence you provided sealed their fate. They'll be going away for a long time." Amanda let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked around, seeing the community members slowly gathering, watching as the people who had terrorized them were taken away. A few familiar faces stepped forward, Mrs. Patel, Mark, Sarah from next door. They thanked Amanda, their voices filled with gratitude. "We couldn't have done this without you," Mark said, his eyes sincere. Amanda shook her head. "This was a group effort. We all fought back." Henry nudged her shoulder. "But let's be honest, you led the charge." Amanda smiled, feeling lighter than she had in weeks. The corrupt HOA was gone, the neighborhood was safe, and now, for the first time, she could finally breathe. She turned to Henry. "Think the new HOA will be better?" He chuckled. "Well, they'd be stupid to mess with you again." Amanda laughed, the sound genuine. Maybe it was over. Maybe now life could finally go back to normal. Life is a way of blindsiding you when you least expect it. My name is Matthew Carter, and this is the story of how my brother's house was ripped away from him while he was serving his country overseas, and how I made sure those responsible paid the price. My brother, Logan Carter, had always been the kind of person who stepped up when others hesitated. As a kid, he would carry groceries for the elderly, mow lawns without expecting payment, and believed in helping his community no matter what. That same sense of duty led him straight into the military, where he quickly rose through the ranks, earning commendations for his dedication and service. Despite the dangers, he never once complained about his deployments. He saw his fellow soldiers as family, bound together by experiences most could never understand. Eventually, after years of careful saving and planning, Logan bought himself a modest 2-story house in a quiet suburban neighborhood. It wasn't flashy, 3 bedrooms, a small backyard, and a cozy living room. But to him, it was everything. A symbol of stability, a piece of home. I still remember the excitement in his voice the day he called me, standing on his new porch with the keys in hand, calling it our place, even though I didn't live there. That was Logan, always generous, always thinking of others. Before his next deployment, he ensured everything was in order. His mortgage was set to auto-pay, his bills were covered, and he gave me power of attorney just in case anything needed handling in his absence. We both assumed everything would be smooth sailing. But life doesn't always work that way. The nightmare began with a phone call from our mother. It was early evening, and I had just gotten off work, sitting in my car, scrolling through messages when the phone rang. Her voice was trembling, something I had rarely heard before. Matthew, they sold Logan's house. My heart slammed against my ribcage. What do you mean, they sold his house? The words barely formed as my throat tightened, dread creeping in. The HOA, she whispered, her voice hollow. They put it up for auction. At that moment, I didn't even know how to react. My mother wasn't someone who panicked easily, so if she was scared, it meant the situation was dire. Without wasting another second, I gripped my keys and drove straight to Logan's house, my mind racing with questions. How could a fully paid mortgage, with no missed payments, be sold? It had to be a mistake, a clerical error. There was no other explanation. But as I turned onto Logan Street, the sight that greeted me confirmed my worst fears. A moving truck sat in the driveway, its back panel rolled up, revealing Logan's belongings being hauled out like discarded junk. His couch, his TV, the wooden shelf where he displayed his military plaques. All of it being handled by strangers with no regard for the memories attached. My stomach churned with rage. I parked behind the truck and stormed out, barely able to keep my composure. And then I saw her, Samantha Turner, the HOA president. She stood on the porch, clipboard in hand, barking orders at the moving crew like she was orchestrating some grand production. I had met her once before. Logan had mentioned her in passing, complaining about her nitpicking ways. She was the kind of person who left aggressive notes about trash bins being an inch out of place and seemed to thrive on controlling the neighborhood. But never in my wildest dreams did I think she would be capable of something like this. Samantha Turner turned around slowly, a smirk forming on her face that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was the kind of expression that made my blood boil, the smug confidence of someone who thought they were untouchable. "Mr. Carter, I was wondering when you'd show up," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, as if I were a child throwing a tantrum. My fists clenched at my sides, but I forced myself to stay calm. "What the hell is going on here?" My voice shook, not from fear, but from the sheer rage bubbling beneath the surface. Samantha let out a dramatic sigh, flipping through the pages on her clipboard with exaggerated slowness. "This property was auctioned off last week due to unpaid HOA fees," she said, feigning boredom. The words didn't make sense. Unpaid HOA fees? Logan was meticulous with his bills, especially anything tied to his house. He had everything automated to avoid even the slightest issue. "That's impossible," I shot back, my voice firm. "My brother is deployed overseas, and his mortgage is paid automatically. He doesn't owe you anything." Samantha arched an eyebrow, as if I were merely amusing her with my protest. "Actually," she said, dragging the word out, "he violated HOA policy by leaving the house unoccupied for over 6 months without filing the required absence paperwork. That's considered abandonment under our rules. I stared at her, struggling to comprehend the absurdity of what I had just heard. Abandonment? I repeated, the word feeling foreign in my mouth. He's not some deadbeat who skipped town. He's serving his country. But Samantha only shrugged, her smirk widening. The law is the law, she said coldly, as if those words excused the sheer cruelty of what she had done. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned to the police officer standing nearby. You're just going to let this happen? I demanded, my voice raw with disbelief. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding my gaze. It's a civil matter, sir. If you have an issue, you'll need to take it to court. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a clerical error. It was a calculated move, and they knew exactly what they were doing. They had found a loophole, exploited it, and were now trying to act as if they had done nothing wrong. And the worst part? They were confident they'd get away with it. I had no choice but to walk away that day, but I wasn't giving up, not by a long shot. I went home, my mind spinning with everything I had just witnessed. The moment I walked through my door, I threw myself into research. I spread out Logan's mortgage documents, bank statements, and HOA letters across my dining table, determined to find any flaw in their reasoning. My brother had done everything right, yet his home had still been taken from him. And that's when I noticed something strange. Hidden in the fine print of the HOA's bylaws were repeated fines for things that made no sense. They had claimed Logan's lawn was neglected, despite him having a landscaping service. They had fined him for having a security camera, even though half the neighborhood had the exact same system installed. These fines weren't just excessive, they were targeted. I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the papers so tightly they crumpled. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. I barely slept that night, my mind racing through every possible way to fight back against the HOA. This wasn't just about Logan's house anymore. This was about exposing the corruption that had allowed this to happen in the first place. By morning, I had already started making calls. First, I contacted the mortgage company, confirming that Logan's payments had been up to date with no missed transactions. Then, I dug into the Service Members Civil Relief Act, a federal law designed to protect deployed military personnel from exactly this kind of situation. What I found made my blood boil. Under the law, an active-duty service member's property could not be foreclosed upon or sold without extensive legal procedures, including a requirement to notify both the service member and their mortgage lender. The HOA had ignored these protections entirely, acting as if they had absolute power over Logan's home. But the worst discovery was yet to come. The so-called auction that had taken place was nothing more than a sham. The buyer? None other than Samantha Turner's cousin. The house had been sold at a fraction of its value, a clear case of insider dealing. The deeper I dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't a one-time event. This was a system they had perfected over time. They targeted homeowners who were away for long periods, imposed fabricated fines, and forced foreclosures, all to seize properties and resell them at rock-bottom prices to their own connections. It was a textbook case of fraud. That's when I knew I needed professional help. I spent the next few hours calling lawyers, explaining the situation. Most of them sympathized, but many told me this would be a long and expensive battle. Some outright refused to take on an HOA, warning that these cases often got tied up in bureaucracy. I was starting to lose hope until a friend referred me to an attorney named Adrian Callahan, a man known for taking on corrupt HOAs and winning. His office was in a modest building, cluttered with legal books, case files, and coffee cups, and his reputation was that of a bulldog, relentless and fearless. The moment I stepped into his office and laid out the case, he didn't hesitate. He leaned back in his chair, a smirk forming as he tapped his pen against his desk. "This isn't just bad," he said, "this is illegal as hell." Those words were all I needed to hear. He immediately started drafting an emergency injunction to freeze the sale of Logan's house, preventing any further transfers of ownership. This was the first step in dismantling the HOA scam. But I wasn't satisfied with just legal action. If the law moved too slowly, I was going to make sure this story reached as many people as possible. That's when I turned to the media, reaching out to military advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and local news outlets. If Samantha and her corrupt board thought they could get away with this quietly, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The moment Adrian filed the emergency injunction, I wasted no time taking the fight to the next level. If the legal process was going to take time, then I would make sure the entire world knew what this HOA had done. I started reaching out to military advocacy groups, veterans organizations, and local news outlets, detailing how a homeowners association had illegally auctioned off the house of a deployed soldier. At first, a few small outlets picked up the story, but it didn't take long before the outrage started spreading. Military families across the country were furious, and social media exploded with people demanding justice. Headlines began appearing, each one more damning than the last, exposing how Logan's home had been stolen under a fraudulent loophole, all while he was overseas defending the very freedoms these HOA members took for granted. Samantha Turner and her board were about to face the kind of scrutiny they never expected. Meanwhile, Adrian was already preparing for the next step. He filed for a lawsuit citing violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, fraud, and illegal foreclosure. The evidence against the HOA was overwhelming. Not only had they failed to notify Logan or his mortgage lender, but they had also engaged in what could only be described as a predatory scheme to steal homes under false pretenses. The judge granted a temporary freeze on any ownership changes, meaning Logan's house couldn't be sold again or modified while the case was ongoing. That was a small victory, but I wanted more. I wanted them exposed. I decided to personally deliver the court order to the HOA office. Walking into their headquarters, I felt a rush of satisfaction as I slammed the legal documents onto Samantha's desk. She barely looked up, but I could see the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For the first time, she wasn't in control, and she knew it. "See you in court," I muttered, keeping my voice steady. Samantha didn't say a word, just tightened her grip on her pen and glanced at the papers. But I wasn't done yet. If they thought they could handle this quietly, they were in for a rude awakening. I started contacting every major news station, military forums, and social media pages that focused on veterans' rights. Within days, the story had gone viral. It wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about every deployed service member who could be at risk of losing their home to a corrupt HOA. The pressure was mounting, and Samantha's smug attitude started to crack. Neighbors began questioning what else the HOA had done behind closed doors. Reports started surfacing about similar cases, where homeowners had been unfairly fined, threatened with foreclosure, and even forced out under shady legal loopholes. The dominoes were falling fast. The court date was set, and as the pressure continued to rise, it was clear that Samantha and her HOA board were running out of ways to escape the truth. As the court date approached, the weight of the case started pressing down on the HOA. What they had assumed would be a quiet, uncontested foreclosure had turned into a nationwide scandal. The more the media covered it, the worse it got for them. Military families, veterans, and even active duty personnel flooded social media with their outrage, demanding accountability. Some even dug into the HOA's past, uncovering that this wasn't the first time they had used questionable tactics against homeowners. Their reputation was crumbling, and Samantha Turner could no longer ignore the storm heading her way. Adrian and I spent countless hours compiling every piece of evidence, making sure that when we entered that courtroom, there would be no way for them to twist the facts. We had mortgage statements proving Logan had never missed a payment, deployment orders showing he was protected under federal law, and documentation revealing how the HOA had manipulated the system to declare his house abandoned. But that wasn't all. Witness testimonies started coming in. Neighbors who had seen the moving truck that day, people who had been pressured by the HOA, and even former board members who admitted that Samantha had been using her position to push through illegal sales. The case wasn't just strong, it was bulletproof. Then came the unexpected twist. A day before the trial, an anonymous tip landed in Adrian's inbox. An email thread between Samantha and other board members, explicitly detailing how they planned to exploit homeowners who couldn't fight back. The messages were damning. In one, Samantha arrogantly boasted about how easy it was to take over properties when the owners were absent, stating that they'll never see it coming. Another message confirmed that Logan's case had been planned well in advance, with a deliberate strategy to rush the auction before anyone could intervene. This was the final nail in their coffin. With this new evidence, Adrian pushed for an even stronger case, adding further charges of fraudulent intent. The night before the trial, I received a call from an unknown number. I answered, and a familiar voice spoke on the other end. It was Samantha Turner. Gone was her usual smug tone. Instead, she sounded panicked, desperate. She tried to negotiate, suggesting a quiet settlement to resolve things without dragging it out. I didn't even let her finish. There was nothing to discuss. This wasn't just about Logan anymore. This was about justice. "See you in court," I said before hanging up. The next morning, as I walked into the courthouse, I knew one thing for certain. No matter what tricks they had left, they were about to face the consequences of their corruption. The courtroom was packed, filled with reporters, military families, neighbors, and even people who had been following the case online. Samantha Turner sat on the other side of the room, flanked by her attorney and a few other HOA board members. But the confidence she once carried was gone. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact with anyone. The judge wasted no time, immediately addressing the case and acknowledging the overwhelming public interest in the trial. Adrian stood up first, presenting the facts with precision. He laid out the clear violations of the Service Members Civil Relief Act, showing how Logan had been unlawfully targeted, how the HOA had completely ignored federal protections, and how the so-called auction was a fraudulent transaction benefiting Samantha's cousin. As each point was laid out, the judge's expression grew more serious. The evidence spoke for itself. Mortgage statements confirming Logan had never missed a payment, HOA records showing fabricated violations, and the newly discovered emails proving the entire scheme had been orchestrated deliberately. When it was time for the HOA's lawyer to respond, they tried to argue that they had followed state guidelines regarding abandoned properties, claiming they had no knowledge of Logan's military status. But Adrian was prepared. He presented emails between Logan and the HOA that explicitly mentioned his deployment, making it clear they had been fully aware. Then, he revealed the biggest blow of the case, the internal HOA emails that showed their deliberate plan to seize Logan's home. The courtroom went silent. Samantha's lawyer scrambled to object, but the damage was done. The judge leaned forward, reading through the emails himself, and then turned to Samantha directly. His voice was firm, cutting through the tense silence. The HOA had not only broken the law, but had done so with full knowledge of their actions, making this more than just negligence. It was fraud. Samantha's face was pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the table as if trying to hold herself together. The HOA board members beside her looked equally panicked, some whispering to each other in hushed tones. Then came the judge's ruling. The foreclosure and sale of Logan's home were declared null and void, restoring full ownership to him immediately. But that wasn't all. The judge also ordered a full investigation into the HOA's practices, stating that this case alone was enough to warrant legal action against multiple individuals involved. The courtroom erupted, murmurs spreading through the audience as reporters rushed to document the verdict. Samantha and her lawyer tried to argue, but the judge wasn't interested in hearing any excuses. There would be no settlement, no quiet resolution. The HOA had played a dangerous game, and now they were paying the price. As I turned to look at Samantha one last time, I saw the reality of her downfall settling in. She had built her power on fear and control, but in the end, justice had caught up to her. The moment the gavel hit the desk, sealing the verdict, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was over. Logan's home was safe, and the people who had tried to steal it were about to face the full force of the law. But even as I walked out of that courtroom, I knew this wasn't just a personal victory. This was a message to every corrupt HOA out there that they weren't untouchable anymore. Walking out of that courtroom, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, but I knew this wasn't the end. The ruling had been a massive victory, but the fight wasn't just about Logan's house anymore. The judge's order for a full investigation meant that the entire HOA board was now under scrutiny, and as the legal process unfolded, the truth about their corruption was coming to light. Reporters wasted no time in digging deeper, uncovering that Logan wasn't the only victim. Over the years, Samantha and her board had targeted multiple homeowners, forcing them into foreclosure through fabricated fines and technicalities. People who had been too exhausted, financially drained, or unaware of their rights had lost their homes, and now, for the first time, they were coming forward. Lawsuits were being filed left and right, homeowners demanding justice, and Samantha Turner, once the untouchable ruler of the HOA, was now facing legal action that went far beyond our case. Adrian and I watched as the walls closed in around them. HOA board members started resigning, some trying to distance themselves from the scandal, while others outright admitted they had been part of the scheme, hoping for leniency in court. But the evidence was too strong. The fraudulent auction of Logan's home had been the tipping point, and now the entire operation was collapsing. Meanwhile, Logan, still overseas, was finally able to catch up on everything that had happened. When I spoke to him on the phone, there was a long silence as he processed it all. He had expected to return to a quiet home, but instead, he was coming back to a story that had shaken the entire community. But more than anything, he was grateful that people had stood up for him, that justice had prevailed, and that he still had a home waiting for him. As the legal battle continued, the fallout spread beyond just our case. Local lawmakers began pushing for changes in HOA regulations, demanding stricter oversight and better protection for homeowners, especially military personnel. What had started as a personal fight had turned into something much bigger, and the thought of it made me realize just how many people had suffered under the unchecked power of corrupt HOAs. The public pressure on Samantha and her associates was relentless. Their assets were frozen, their powers stripped away, and they were now facing a court battle that would likely end in criminal charges. The smug, arrogant Samantha had once displayed was gone, replaced with desperation as she tried to navigate the consequences of her actions. But there was no way out. The damage she had done was irreversible, and for once, she was the one with no control over the situation. The neighborhood itself had changed too. The HOA, now under temporary management, was being restructured, and the fear that had once gripped homeowners had disappeared. People spoke freely, openly questioning policies that had gone unchallenged for years. The community had come together in a way no one had expected, and as I looked around, I realized that this fight had done more than just expose corruption. It had given people back their voice. But there was still one final moment left in this battle, the one that mattered the most. Logan was coming home, and this time, he wouldn't be walking into a stolen house or a broken neighborhood. He would be coming back to a community that had fought for him, and that was a victory far greater than anything I had imagined. The day Logan returned home was unlike anything I had ever seen. As I drove to the airport, I felt the weight of everything that had happened over the past few months. This had started as a desperate fight to save his home, but it had turned into something far bigger, a movement that exposed corruption and forced change. When I pulled up to the arrival section, I spotted Logan immediately. He looked exhausted but relieved, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder as he scanned the crowd. The moment he saw me, his expression shifted from uncertainty to a familiar grin, the same one he had when we were kids and had just pulled off some ridiculous prank. I stepped out of the car, and before I could say a word, he pulled me into a hug, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had happened. As we drove back, I tried to explain everything: the court battle, the media firestorm, the sheer number of people who had rallied behind him. Logan listened quietly, his gaze fixed outside the window, taking in the neighborhood he had nearly lost. When we finally turned onto his street, he let out a sharp breath. The driveway was filled with neighbors, friends, and even people he didn't know, all gathered to welcome him home. Flags waved, homemade signs covered the lawn, and a banner stretched across his porch with the words, "Welcome home, Logan." I glanced at him, half expecting him to be overwhelmed, but instead, he just shook his head in disbelief. He stepped out of the car, and within seconds, people surrounded him, shaking his hand, clapping him on the back, thanking him for his service. Some of the veterans in the neighborhood stood off to the side, offering silent salutes, a gesture that carried more meaning than words ever could. As Logan made his way through the crowd, he stopped at the porch, running a hand over the railing as if confirming it was real. He turned to me, his voice low but steady, asking if everything was really over. I nodded, telling him that his house was safe, that the HOA was in shambles, and that Samantha Turner was facing legal consequences for everything she had done. For the first time since he had landed, I saw him truly relax. He took a deep breath, stepping inside his home, his fingers brushing against the doorframe. I followed him in, watching as he walked through each room, taking it all in. The furniture had been rearranged, the walls repainted, but it was still his home. The sense of loss that had once lingered was gone, replaced with something stronger: justice, victory, and the undeniable truth that he had won. That night, we sat on the porch as the last of the neighbors left, the air filled with the distant hum of cicadas. Logan leaned back in his chair, staring up at the sky, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, with a quiet chuckle, he muttered that he never expected to come home to a full-blown legal war. I laughed, shaking my head, telling him that he owed me for the stress. He smirked, saying he would make it up to me someday. And in that moment, I realized that despite everything, despite the months of chaos, corruption, and uncertainty, we had won. Not just against the HOA, not just for Logan's house, but for every person who had ever been wronged by people who thought they were above the law. The battle was over, but the impact of what we had done would last forever. The weeks following Logan's return felt surreal. The HOA, once a feared entity in the neighborhood, had collapsed under the weight of its corruption. Samantha Turner, once untouchable, was now facing multiple lawsuits and potential criminal charges. The rest of the HOA board had either resigned or disappeared, trying to avoid the fallout, but it was too late. The state had stepped in, launching an official investigation into not just our case, but every foreclosure the HOA had processed in the past 5 years. More homeowners came forward, sharing their own stories of intimidation, unfair fines, and sudden foreclosures that had forced them from their homes. Logan's case had set off a chain reaction, and the legal system was finally holding these people accountable. Meanwhile, the neighborhood had transformed. The fear that had once loomed over homeowners was gone, replaced with a newfound sense of unity. A new HOA was formed, this time led by residents who valued transparency and fairness. Monthly meetings were held where people could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. Homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak up were now actively involved, ensuring that nothing like this could ever happen again. But for Logan, the real victory wasn't just getting his house back. It was the overwhelming support he had received from people all over the country. Veterans, active duty soldiers, and even complete strangers had reached out, sharing their outrage and standing with him through it all. He had gone from being a victim of a corrupt system to a symbol of resilience, and though he never sought the attention, he appreciated knowing that his story had made a difference. As for Samantha, the last we heard, she had left town, her reputation in ruins. No matter where she went, the internet had made sure that her name would always be associated with one of the most egregious HOA scandals in history. She had built her career on control and power, but in the end, both had been stripped away, leaving her with nothing. Logan and I never spoke about her much after that. She wasn't worth the energy. Instead, we focused on moving forward. Logan took some time off to settle back into civilian life, reconnecting with old friends and spending time with our mother, who had been waiting anxiously for him to come home. As for me, the entire experience had changed something inside me. I had fought for Logan, but in the process, I had learned just how many people had suffered in silence, powerless against the corruption of HOAs that had too much unchecked authority. I started looking into advocacy work, connecting with organizations that help military families fight legal battles just like the one we had won. Adrian, ever the bulldog, encouraged me to take it seriously, saying I had a knack for exposing fraud and injustice. I wasn't sure where it would lead me, but I knew one thing: I was never going to let something like this happen to anyone else without a fight. One evening, as Logan and I sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the neighborhood he had nearly lost, he turned to me and smirked, saying that if I ever needed a place to crash, his door was always open. I laughed, shaking my head, realizing that despite everything, some things never changed. Logan was home, justice had been served, And for the first time in a long time, the world felt right again. Roy Baxter had lived on that land for over 50 years, and his family had owned it for nearly a century before that. 150 acres of rolling fields, dense woods, and a stretch of river that cut through the property like a silver thread. It was a farm once, a successful one, back when his father was alive and when Roy had the energy to work the land the way it was meant to be worked. Now, it was a place of peace, a retreat from the world that had grown too chaotic, too fast, and too greedy. He didn't cultivate much anymore, just enough to keep himself busy. Some vegetables, a few apple trees that still bore decent fruit, and enough wild animals wandering through the property that he never had to worry about an empty dinner plate. It wasn't about the farm anymore. It was about the land itself, the history buried in its soil, the life he had built there with his own hands. But the world had a way of creeping in, even when you'd spent a lifetime keeping it out. It started with a letter. Roy found it in his mailbox one morning, tucked in between a pile of junk ads and a utility bill. He almost didn't open it, assuming it was just another pointless notice from some bureaucratic office trying to sell him something unnecessary. But something about the thick, official-looking envelope made him hesitate. The return address was from a real estate development firm he had never heard of. That alone was enough to put a bad taste in his mouth. Inside, the letter was cold and direct. His property had been absorbed into a newly designated residential area, and as a result, it was now subject to new regulations, new fees, and new obligations. A homeowner association had been formed, and Roy was now, as of this notice, a member. He would be expected to pay annual dues, follow community guidelines, and make necessary adjustments to his property to bring it up to the new requirements. The wording was emotionless, corporate, and absolutely infuriating. Roy scoffed, crumpled the paper in his calloused fist, and tossed it into the wood-burning stove without a second thought. They had chosen the wrong man. A few days later, the second letter arrived, this one more aggressive. A fine had been issued for property maintenance violations. His barn was labeled an eyesore. His fencing was non-compliant, and there were unregistered vehicles and equipment on the premises. A total of $10,000 in penalties. The notice gave him 30 days to pay. Roy didn't even bother burning this one. He tossed it on the counter, grabbed his truck, keys, and drove straight to the town office. He was ready to tell them exactly where they could shove their regulations and fines. The office was small, tucked between a bank and a law firm. One of those places that looked more like a doctor's waiting room than a place where decisions were made that could tear a man's life apart. A receptionist barely looked up from her desk as he walked in. But when he dropped the letter on the counter, hard enough to rattle the pen holder, she finally acknowledged him. "I need to speak to someone about this." His voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the irritation in his tone. She glanced at the letter, sighed like she'd seen 100 of them that week, and gestured toward the hallway. "Office at the end. Mr. Duke will answer your questions." That name meant nothing to Roy, but he had a feeling he wasn't going to like whoever it belonged to. Vincent Duke was everything Roy expected. Mid-40s, suit a little too sharp for a man who didn't actually work with his hands, and a smile that was too polished to be real. He didn't offer a handshake, just leaned back in his chair, arms folded, as Roy stepped into the office. "Mr. Baxter," Duke said as if he were greeting an old friend. "I was wondering when you'd come in. Please have a seat." Roy didn't sit. He crossed his arms and stayed planted where he was. "I'm not paying a damn fine for land that belongs to me, and I'm not part of any damn association." Duke sighed as if Roy were a slow student struggling with a simple lesson. "I understand this might be frustrating, but the matter is already settled. The county approved the expansion plans last year, and all properties within the new boundary lines fall under the association's governance. It's standard procedure." "Not for me, it ain't." "Well, that's where we disagree." Duke smiled like a man who had already won. "Your land is now part of an incorporated development. The benefits are numerous. Road, maintenance, security, property value, protection. Roy cut him off with a scoff. Spare me the sales pitch. I didn't sign anything. You didn't need to. Duke replied smoothly. The jurisdiction change was handled at the county level. Everything is perfectly legal. Roy stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled through his nose. So what happens if I don't pay? Duke's smile widened just a fraction. Then the fines accumulate. If they remain unpaid, a lien is placed on the property. If the debt surpasses a certain threshold, the property can be seized and auctioned to cover the balance. Again, all perfectly legal. Roy didn't move, didn't react, didn't blink. He just stared at Duke like a man studying something rotten. Finally, he said, "You get a lot of men my age in here, don't you? Sitting where I am now, arguing the same thing." Duke just kept smiling. Roy nodded, already knowing the answer. "How many of them fight back?" Duke let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head like Roy was amusing him. "Not many." Roy absorbed that. Then he turned, walked out without another word, and slammed the door behind him. He drove home in silence, hands gripping the steering, well tighter than necessary. The road was familiar, every turn and bump memorized from years of travel. But today it all felt different, like the land itself was shifting beneath him. When he reached his property, he sat in the truck for a long moment, staring at the field stretching out before him. His land, his home, and now they were telling him it belonged to someone else. Not a chance in hell. Stepping out, he walked toward the barn, boots crunching against the dirt path. The place was old, weathered by years of storms and use. But it stood strong, just like he did. Inside, he pulled open an old metal filing cabinet, rusted at the edges. Papers, documents, everything that had ever mattered regarding this land, neatly stored in thick folders. He found the one he wanted, pulling out his original deed. His name in bold letters, the legal proof that this land was his. No homeowner association, no government order, just his rights on paper. They were trying to steal what wasn't theirs. He ran a finger over the embossed seal, a symbol of his family's legacy. His father had taught him that a man fought for what was his. And that's exactly what he intended to do. Roy spent the next few hours digging through everything he had. Land surveys, county records, old tax documents. Anything that might prove this whole thing was a scam. The more he read, the angrier he got. They had no right. This wasn't some abandoned lot waiting to be developed. This was his home, his history, and he wasn't about to roll over and accept their terms. Stepping back outside, he took in the view again. The rolling fields, the distant tree line, the old fencing that stretched for miles. Every inch of it belonged to him. And if they thought they could take it without a fight, they were about to learn otherwise. The next morning, he made his first move. Calling the county records office, he demanded to see every document filed regarding the so-called rezoning. The woman on the line hesitated as if unsure how to respond. "Sir, those files are sensitive." "Not to me, they ain't," Roy interrupted. "I own the land. I have the right to know what deals were made behind my back." The woman sighed, then relented, telling him to come in the following day. Hanging up, Roy wasn't satisfied. He needed backup, someone who knew the system better than he did, someone who could tear their fraudulent claims apart. He wasn't just going to fight this. He was going to bury them. Roy called an old friend, a lawyer who didn't lose fights. Lawrence Cole had built his reputation taking down corrupt officials and shady businesses. He wasn't the kind of man who played by the rules if the rules were designed to cheat honest people. When Lawrence answered the phone, his voice was as sharp as ever. "Roy Baxter, it's been a long time. What kind of trouble have you stepped into now?" Roy smirked, but there was no humor in it. The kind that steals a man's land out from under him. He laid it all out, explaining the letters, the fines, the so-called homeowner association takeover. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then Lawrence exhaled slowly. These bastards really don't know who they're messing with, do they? That's what I plan to teach them. You got paperwork, proof that this land was never part of their association. Roy glanced at the pile of documents on his kitchen table. Everything I need. Lawrence hummed, approvingly. Good. Then we have something to work with. This isn't just a civil case, Roy. If they forged county approvals or pressured officials into rezoning without consent, that's fraud. We could be looking at criminal charges. Roy leaned back in his chair, feeling the first real sense of momentum. So what's the next move? First, we go public. They rely on people backing down because they don't have the resources to fight. You're going to make this loud. Let the town know what's happening. Get other property owners to speak up. Then we put pressure on the county records office. Make it clear that if they don't release every document tied to this land grab, they're complicit. If there's a dirty money trail, we find it. Roy nodded, already standing. I like the sound of that. I figured you would. Lawrence chuckled. Meet me tomorrow. We're going to raise hell. Roy hung up, his jaw set. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. If they could do this to him, they'd do it to anyone. That night, he started making calls. Friends, neighbors, people who had lived in the area long before these new developments started creeping in. And just as he suspected, he wasn't the only one. Others had received letters, fines, threats, all designed to push them off their own land. By the time morning rolled around, Roy wasn't alone. He had an army behind him. The next day, Roy and Lawrence walked into the county records office together. Unlike before, Roy wasn't alone, and he wasn't playing defense. He was here to put these people on notice. The clerk at the front desk looked up, eyes widening slightly at the sight of Lawrence Cole standing beside Roy. Lawyers had that effect on people, especially ones with reputations. We need access to all documents related to the recent rezoning changes, Lawrence said, his voice calm but firm. The clerk hesitated, shifting in her seat. I'm not sure if those records are publicly accessible. Lawrence smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. They are when the changes were made illegally. If you deny access, you're interfering with an investigation. The woman paled slightly, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Give me a moment. She disappeared into the back office, leaving Roy and Lawrence standing in tense silence. A few minutes later, a man in a suit emerged. He was younger than Roy expected, mid-30s, with slick-back hair and a name badge that read, County Record Supervisor Mark Jensen. Gentlemen, is there a problem? He asked, his tone already laced with condescension. Roy felt his temper spike, but Lawrence beat him to it. The problem, Mr. Jensen, is that the Homeowner Association has illegally reclassified private land, and we're here to see the documents proving it. Jensen exhaled sharply. This again. Look, I've already had multiple requests about this issue. The zoning changes were approved through the proper channels. If you have complaints, take it up with the Planning Commission. Lawrence stepped closer, his presence towering. We will, but first we're getting those documents. And if they've been altered, backdated, or falsely approved, you better believe you'll be the first one held accountable. Jensen's jaw tightened. I need authorization from my supervisor. Then call them, Lawrence replied, because we aren't leaving without those files. After a long, tense silence, Jensen relented, motioning for the clerk to pull the records. Roy watched as file after file was stacked on the counter. When he flipped through the first document, his anger boiled over. The signatures approving the rezoning weren't county officials. They were signed by Vincent, Duke, Todd Hammond, and several members of the Homeowner Association Board. Lawrence let out a low whistle. Well, looks like they didn't even try to hide it. Roy clenched his fists. They didn't think anyone would question them. They're about to find out how wrong they were. Roy and Lawrence took copies of every document they could get their hands on. The evidence was piling up fast, and the deeper they dug, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about Roy's land. This was a pattern. Over The past 2 years, multiple properties had been absorbed into the homeowner association's control, all under the same fraudulent rezoning orders. They left the county office with stacks of paperwork enough to build a solid case. But Roy knew evidence alone wouldn't be enough. The homeowner association had money, connections, and influence. They weren't going to roll over without a fight. "We need to move fast," Lawrence said, flipping through the files. "If they get wind that we have these documents, they'll try to bury this. Lawsuits, delay tactics, maybe even threats." Roy wasn't surprised. "Let them try," he muttered. The next step was getting the town on their side. Roy started calling every property owner he knew, warning them about what was happening. Some had already been hit with fines and penalties. Others were just starting to receive their first notices. By the end of the day, they had a growing list of people ready to fight. Lawrence made sure the legal side was covered, drafting cease and desist orders against the homeowner association to halt any further land seizures. But Roy wasn't stopping at legal action. He reached out to Nina Moreno, the investigative journalist who had built a reputation exposing corruption. She listened carefully as Roy laid out everything they had discovered. "This is big," she said after a long pause. "If what you're telling me checks out, this could be fraud, racketeering, even conspiracy. You have enough to take this to the state attorney's office." "We will," Lawrence assured, "but we want this public. People need to know what's happening." Nina agreed and promised to start digging into the homeowner association's financial records. They weren't just going to fight this in court. They were going to expose it. That evening, Roy stood on his porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. His land was still his for now, but he knew the real battle was just beginning. The homeowner association had made a mistake. They thought they could intimidate him into submission. They thought he'd back down like so many others. But they didn't know Roy Baxter. The first sign that the homeowner association knew they were in trouble came the next morning. Roy woke to the sound of a truck idling outside his property. Stepping onto his porch, he spotted two men in suits standing by the front gate. One of them was holding a clipboard, the other had a phone pressed to his ear. Roy didn't like visitors, especially not the kind that showed up unannounced. He walked down the dirt path, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Can I help you?" His voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath it. One of the men glanced up, flashing a too-practiced smile. "Mr. Baxter, my name is Richard Hale, legal counsel for the Homeowner Association. This here's my colleague, Andrew Parks. We were hoping to have a conversation." Roy crossed his arms. "About what?" Hale adjusted his tie. "We understand there's been some confusion regarding the new zoning regulations. We wanted to clear up any misunderstandings before this situation escalates." Roy smirked. "You mean before it blows up in your faces?" Hale's smile tightened. "There's no need for hostility, Mr. Baxter. We're simply here to offer a resolution." "Resolution," Roy repeated. "That's an interesting word for a scam." Parks finally spoke up, his voice softer, more calculated. "There are ways to settle this amicably. The association is willing to waive the outstanding fines and fees provided you sign an agreement recognizing the authority of the homeowner association moving forward." Roy let out a low chuckle. "So let me get this straight. You show up, slap me with fines for rules I never agreed to, try to steal my land, and now you think I'll sign a deal just because you promised to take the fees away." Hale exhaled slowly. "Mr. Baxter, this is a generous offer. If you refuse, the fines will continue to accrue, and legal action will follow." Roy's smile faded. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to make sure they heard every word. "You tell your people that I don't scare easy. You want to fight, you got one. And when this is over, I won't just get my land back. I'll make sure every last one of you answers for what you've done." Hale and Parks exchanged a glance. "Suit yourself," Hale said, his voice clipped. "But you're making a mistake." "We'll see," Roy muttered. He turned and walked back to his house, leaving them standing by the gate. They had come to intimidate him, to make him fold before the real fight began. But they had underestimated him. That was their biggest mistake. By noon, Roy received a call from Lawrence with news that changed everything. The county zoning board was now under investigation, thanks to Nina's report hitting the local news. More importantly, the homeowner association had officially lawyered up, bringing in a high-powered legal team from the city. "They're scared," Lawrence said over the phone, "which means we've got them right where we want them." Roy let out a dry chuckle. "Let them bring in their fancy lawyers. I'm not backing down." "Good, because it's time to hit back hard. I've filed injunctions to freeze any further land seizures. But that's not enough. We need to force them into a corner." "How do we do that?" Roy asked. Lawrence hesitated, then said, "We make it personal." Roy's brow furrowed. "Personal how?" "We go after Vincent Duke directly. He's the one orchestrating this, the one who profits most from these illegal land grabs. If we expose his financial interests, show the community how much he's gained from this corruption, we can turn public opinion against him." Roy liked the sound of that. "What do you need me to do?" "I need you at the town meeting tonight. Nina will be there, cameras rolling, reporters ready. We put this in front of the whole town, force Duke to defend himself." Roy didn't hesitate. "I'll be there." That evening, the town hall was packed. Dozens of homeowners had shown up, many of them carrying their own notices of fines, penalties, or threats from the homeowner association. At the front, Vincent Duke sat, his usual smug confidence cracking under the weight of the growing pressure. Lawrence spoke first, laying out the evidence they had gathered. He showed copies of forged zoning approvals, financial transactions linking Duke to land purchases, and statements from displaced homeowners. "This isn't just about one man's land," Lawrence said, turning to face the crowd. "This is about corruption, about greed, about people using their power to take what isn't theirs." Roy stood up then, holding his own stack of documents. "These people want us to believe we have no choice, that they make the rules and we just have to live with it. Well, I say no." The crowd erupted, people shouting in agreement, others demanding action. Vincent Duke rose, adjusting his tie, clearing his throat. "Let's not be hasty, folks. These claims are exaggerated." Roy narrowed his eyes. "Then prove it. Show us the records that say we agreed to this. Show us the laws that say you had the right to take our homes." Duke had no answer. And just like that, the tides turned. The next morning, the homeowner association retaliated in the only way they knew how. Roy woke up to find a bright red notice nailed to his front gate. Final demand, immediate compliance required. The fine had tripled overnight, now standing at a ridiculous $30,000. Roy tore the notice down, his jaw tightening. They were desperate, and desperate people made mistakes. He walked back inside, already dialing Lawrence's number. "They're pushing harder," Roy said the moment Lawrence picked up. "I figured they would," Lawrence replied, his voice steady. "That means we re-getting to them." Roy exhaled slowly. "So, what's the next move?" "We hit them with everything. I've already filed motions to challenge every fine they've issued in the last 2 years. If they want to fight this in court, we make it as painful as possible for them." Roy smirked. "That's what I like to hear. But we also need to go further," Lawrence continued. "We're not just fighting fines. We're fighting the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. I want names. Who inside the county office signed off on this? Who pushed these zoning changes through?" Roy nodded, already thinking. "I know exactly where to start." That afternoon, he drove back into town, parking outside a small diner where county employees often ate lunch. He stepped inside, spotting Mark Jensen, the county records supervisor, sitting in the corner, with his head buried in a stack of papers. Roy grabbed a chair, flipped it around, and sat across from him. Jensen, startled, looking up with wide eyes. "Mr. Baxter, what are you—" "We're going to have a little chat," Roy interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "About how exactly my land ended up on the homeowner association's list." Jensen swallowed hard, glancing around as if looking for an escape. I don't know if I can. I think you do, Roy cut in, and I think you're gonna tell me before this gets worse for you. Jensen exhaled shakily. I didn't have a choice. Orders came from higher up. Vincent Duke had people inside the county office. He made sure the zoning changes were pushed through without question. Roy's fist clenched. And what did you get in return? Jensen hesitated. A promotion. A raise. I didn't think. That's the problem, Roy growled. None of you thought about the people losing their land. Jensen looked away, ashamed. If I talk, they'll ruin me. Roy leaned forward. They're already ruined, but you have a chance to do the right thing. Jensen swallowed hard, then nodded. Okay, I'll testify. Roy sat back, satisfied. Another piece of the puzzle was falling into place. That night, Roy met with Lawrence to prepare for what came next. The case was growing bigger, faster than either of them had expected. With Mark Jensen agreeing to testify, they now had direct proof of corruption inside the county office. This changes everything, Lawrence said, skimming through the statements Roy had written down. If Jensen talks under oath, we can push for a full county-level investigation. Roy nodded, but his mind was already moving ahead. We can't let them cover this up. They'll try to bury it behind red tape, slow the process down until people forget. Lawrence smirked. That's why we're taking this public. I already called Nina. She's running the story first thing in the morning. Once this hits the news, the county won't be able to ignore it. Roy exhaled a slow, satisfied breath. Then let's make sure they feel the pressure. The next morning, the town woke up to headlines that shook everything. Homeowner Association fraud exposed. Illegal property seizures tied to county officials. The reaction was immediate. People flooded the town hall, demanding answers. The mayor was forced to address the situation, promising a full investigation. Meanwhile, Todd, Hammond, and Vincent Duke were nowhere to be seen. But Roy knew it wasn't over. That afternoon, his phone rang again. This time it was an unknown number. He answered cautiously. Mr. Baxter, a familiar voice said. It was Vincent Duke. I think we need to talk. Roy smirked. Talk, huh? I don't think we have much left to say. I think we do, Duke replied smoothly. Things have gotten out of control. I'm willing to negotiate. Roy's jaw tightened. You mean you're finally scared? Duke chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Let's just say, I prefer settling matters privately. I can make this go away, Mr. Baxter. You walk away, and I'll erase every fine against your property. Roy let the silence drag. Then he spoke slow and deliberate. I don't want your deal. I want justice. Duke sighed, his voice losing its slick confidence. Think about it, Roy. This doesn't end well for you either. Roy smiled. You really don't get it, do you? This isn't about me. This is about every person you've stolen from. And trust me, Duke, this is ending real soon. He hung up, not giving Duke a chance to respond. He had all the confirmation he needed. They were cracking under the pressure, and soon enough they'd fall. 2 days later, the first arrest was made. Mark Jensen had provided enough evidence to push for an emergency court order, and with the investigation now in full swing, law enforcement had no choice but to act. Todd Hammond, the so-called president of the Homeowner Association, was taken into custody on charges of fraud, conspiracy, and illegal land seizure. The moment the news hit, Roy knew things were about to unravel fast. He stood on his porch, watching as a news van pulled up, reporters scrambling out with cameras already rolling. He had expected this. Nina Moreno had told him the night before that once the first domino fell, the media would be all over it. The reporter approached him, microphone in hand. Mr. Baxter, can you comment on today's arrest? Roy exhaled slowly, arms crossed. About time was all he said. And do you believe more arrests will follow? The reporter pressed. Roy smirked. If there's any justice left in this town, there will be. Meanwhile, Vincent Duke had gone silent, no longer making statements, no longer acting like the smug, untouchable businessman he had been. But Roy wasn't fooled. Men like Duke didn't just roll over. They fought until the bitter end. And he was waiting for it. Later that evening, he met with Lawrence, reviewing the next steps. "We're getting close," Lawrence said, scanning the legal documents spread out on the table. "But we need to keep the pressure on. They're going to try to stall, delay, bury this in bureaucracy." Roy nodded. "Then we don't give them the chance." He picked up the latest set of court filings, ones that push for a full audit of all properties seized under the homeowner association. "If we can prove they've been running this scam for years, we take down more than just Hammond. We take down the entire system that let this happen." Lawrence grinned. "Now you're thinking like a man who wants to win." The next morning, more subpoenas were issued, demanding financial records, tax filings, and internal communications from the homeowner association board. That was when the second arrest happened. A county official, tied to falsified zoning approvals, was charged with accepting bribes in exchange for pushing the illegal land seizures through. It was spreading now just like Roy had hoped. The whole corrupt system was crumbling from the inside, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The final blow came when Vincent Duke finally broke his silence. For weeks, he had been dodging reporters, refusing to comment on the mounting evidence. But when Todd Hammond was officially denied bail and the FBI started looking into financial records, Duke knew he was running out of options. Instead of facing charges, he did what Roy had expected. He tried to cut a deal. The news broke that afternoon, spreading like wildfire across town. Duke had agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. He was willing to testify that the entire homeowner association scheme had been built on fraudulent land seizures, backroom deals, and illegal rezoning tactics. More importantly, he was ready to name names from county officials who had approved the transfers to developers who had paid for priority access to stolen land. Roy sat in his truck outside the diner, reading the report on his phone, letting the weight of it settle. It was happening. The corruption was being dragged into the light, and there was no stopping it now. A few minutes later, his phone rang. It was Lawrence. "Well, that didn't take long," the lawyer said, sounding satisfied. "Duke folded faster than I thought he would." Roy let out a slow breath. He knows he's got no way out. This is his only chance to save himself. Lawrence agreed. And if he names enough people, this might not just be a county investigation anymore. The feds are watching this now. They might step in. That was exactly what Roy wanted to hear. He had started this fight just trying to save his own land, but now it was bigger than that. The entire system that had allowed men like Hammond and Duke to operate for years was finally being torn apart. And once the FBI got involved, there would be no more loopholes, no more county-level deals to sweep things under the rug. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, Roy stood on his porch, looking out at the land he had nearly lost. It was still his, just as it had always been. But now it would stay that way, not just for him, but for every person who had been cheated by the corrupt system. He had fought back, and he had won. With the case breaking open, Roy attended the final town hall meeting, knowing this was the moment everything came to a head. The room was packed, standing room only, with people demanding answers, demanding justice. The mayor sat at the front, looking more nervous than ever, flanked by county officials who were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal. Reporters lined the walls, cameras rolling as the tension in the room thickened. Roy sat near the front, arms crossed, watching as Vincent Duke was led inside by his attorney, looking more like a man awaiting sentencing than the smug businessman he had once been. Lawrence leaned over. "This is it. He's got no more moves left." Roy nodded, never taking his eyes off Duke. The meeting began, and the mayor attempted to speak, but the crowd wasn't interested in political pleasantries. People shouted, demanding explanations, demanding resignations. The corruption had been exposed, the lies uncovered, and no one in that room was willing to be quiet about it anymore. When Vincent Duke finally stood, the noise died down, replaced by an eerie silence. He cleared his throat, looking out at the sea of angry faces. "Mistakes were made," he began, his voice unsteady, "and I take full responsibility for my role in this." A murmur ran through the crowd, some scoffing, others waiting to see if he would actually tell the truth. But the moment that truly sealed his fate came next. "I was not the mastermind," Duke continued, "and I was not alone. This operation was approved at multiple levels, with the knowledge of county officials, legal advisors, and business investors who stood to profit from these land seizures. He reached in his briefcase, pulled out a thick stack of documents, and handed them to the mayor. "I am submitting this evidence as part of my cooperation agreement." A ripple of shock spread across the room. Lawrence exhaled slowly. He just threw everyone under the bus. Roy smirked. "Good." The mayor fumbled with the papers, scanning them quickly before looking up, his face pale. "Effective immediately. The homeowner association is dissolved," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "And a full independent audit will be conducted on every property transfer over the last 5 years." The room erupted in cheers, people clapping, shouting, some even hugging. The battle was over. The corrupt system that had terrorized homeowners for years was officially dead. As the meeting ended, Roy stepped outside, breathing in the cool night air. Lawrence clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did it." Roy shook his head. "No, we all did." In the following weeks, arrests continued as the investigation deepened. More county officials were taken into custody, and new evidence surfaced almost daily. The FBI had officially stepped in, expanding the case beyond just local corruption. What started as a small homeowner association scandal had turned into a full-blown federal investigation. Roy watched it all unfold from a distance, his focus no longer on revenge, but on ensuring no one else suffered the way he had. The land was his again, but this fight had never just been about him. He spent his days tending to his farm, fixing fences that had fallen into disrepair while the battle raged. But unlike before, when it had felt like he was standing alone against a giant, he now had a community behind him. People had found their voices. They had fought back, and they had won. One afternoon, as Roy was working near the barn, a familiar truck pulled into his driveway. Lawrence stepped out, a thick envelope in hand. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing it over. Roy opened it, scanning the legal documents inside. A final court ruling. Every fraudulent fine, every illegal lien, every attempt to steal his land, officially erased. His ownership restored beyond any doubt. He let out a slow breath. "It's over." Lawrence nodded. "It's over." But not for them. Todd Hammond had been sentenced to prison time. Vincent Duke had disappeared into federal custody, and multiple county officials were facing long legal battles of their own. The town was already changing, with new leadership promising transparency and accountability. It didn't mean corruption would never return, but for now, the people had control again. As Lawrence leaned against the truck, he smirked. "So, what's next for Roy Baxter?" Roy glanced at his land, the fields stretching out beneath the golden light of the afternoon sun. He had spent months fighting, but now, for the first time in a long while, peace had returned. He smiled. "I think I'll just enjoy what's mine." A month later, Roy stood on his porch, watching the sunrise over his land. The fight was over, the dust had settled, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was nothing left to battle. The quiet was different now. It wasn't the silence of uncertainty or tension. It was the peace of knowing that justice had been served. His land was his again, not because some paper said so, but because he had refused to let anyone take it from him. The town had changed in the aftermath. New officials had taken over, promising to clean up the corruption that had festered for years. The homeowner association was gone, its name now nothing more than a bitter memory. People had reclaimed their homes, their properties, their rights. And Roy had reclaimed something too, his faith in standing up and fighting back, in refusing to be pushed aside. As he sipped his morning coffee, a truck pulled up the long dirt road. Lawrence stepped out, carrying a newspaper under one arm. "Thought you might want to see this," he said, handing it over. Roy unfolded the paper, scanning the front page. Final convictions handed down in HOA corruption scandal. Todd Hammond, prison sentence confirmed. Vincent Duke, permanent disbarment, financial restitution ordered. Several former county officials, charged and awaiting sentencing. Roy smirked. "Looks like they got what was coming." Lawrence grinned. "They always do. Eventually, you did more than just win, Roy. You changed things." Roy nodded, setting the paper aside. That wasn't why he had fought. He had fought because it was the only choice he had. But knowing that his battle had helped others, well, that was something worth remembering. He glanced at Lawrence. "So, what now?" Lawrence chuckled. That's up to you. You planning on staying out of trouble for a while? Roy smirked. No promises. Lawrence laughed, shaking his head. Well, if you ever need a lawyer again, you know where to find me. Roy watched as his friend drove off, then turned back to his land. The sun was higher now, casting long golden shadows over the fields. He had worked this land, fought for it, protected it, and now he was finally free to enjoy it. Roy sat on his porch, listening to the wind move through the trees. The fight was behind him now, a storm that had come and gone, leaving behind clearer skies. The land stretched out before him, unchanged, steady, the same soil that had been in his family for generations. It felt different now, though, not because the land itself had changed, but because Roy had. He had spent his life avoiding trouble, keeping to himself, letting the world go on without him. But when they had come for what was his, he had made a choice. He had fought, and he had won. The town had moved on, but the effects of his battle remained. People no longer lived in fear of the homeowner association. There were no more fraudulent fines, no more threats hanging over homeowners who just wanted to live in peace. The corruption had been torn out by its roots, and those responsible were paying the price. Roy had never cared much for politics, but he knew what it felt like to be cheated, to be backed into a corner with no way out. And now, because he had refused to give in, the town was better for it. As he sat there, sipping his coffee, he spotted a familiar truck rolling up the dirt road. It was Henry Lawson, one of the many homeowners who had nearly lost everything. He climbed out, tipping his hat as he walked up the steps. Thought I'd drop by. See how you're doing, Henry said. Roy nodded, gesturing toward the other chair on the porch. You got time for coffee? Always, Henry chuckled, settling in. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the wind roll across the fields. Then Henry let out a slow breath. You know, most folks would have folded when they came knocking. Would have paid the fines, let them take what they wanted. But you. Henry shook his head. You never backed down. That's something, Roy. Roy gave a small smirk. Just did what needed doing. Henry laughed. Well, you did more than that. You reminded folks what it means to stand up for yourself. Roy didn't answer right away. He just let the words settle, watching as a hawk soared overhead, free, untouchable. Maybe that was the real victory, not just getting his land back, but proving that no one had the right to take what wasn't theirs. The town had learned that lesson, and Roy had made sure they wouldn't forget it. As the afternoon sun warmed the porch, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow, content breath. He had fought. He had won. And now, at long last, he could rest,